Perry Mason, The Case of the Beautiful Beggar, by Erle Stanley Gardner. Della Street, Perry Mason's confidential secretary, regarded the lawyer with pleading eyes. "Chief, please see her." Mason frowned. "I have this 10:30 appointment, Della, and before I see this man, I want to... oh, well. I don't want to ruin your day. What's it all about?" "She's just arrived in Los Angeles from the Orient. She came by way of Honolulu. She has a letter from her uncle telling her to get in touch with you immediately upon her arrival here and before she goes home." "And she didn't send a wire asking for an appointment?" Mason asked. "She isn't that kind. She's about 22, naive, demure, quiet-spoken, and very much disturbed." "She was told to see me immediately on arrival?" "That's right. Her uncle, Horace Shelby, wrote her a letter and..." "What's in the letter?" "I don't know. She said her uncle had told her not to show it to any living mortal except Perry Mason." "Show her in." Mason rose as Della ushered in a beautiful young woman. "This is Daphne Shelby," she said. Daphne shyly mumbled a greeting, opened her purse, took out a letter, said, "Thank you very much for seeing me, Mr. Mason. I guess I should have sent a wireless, but I was too upset." Della passed the letter and envelope across to Mason. "Won't you sit down?" She seated herself somewhat tentatively in the straight-backed chair across from his desk. Mason regarded her thoughtfully. "How old are you?" 22. "You wanted to see me about your uncle?" "Yes, Horace Shelby." "How old is he?" 75. "He's your uncle?" "Yes," she said, noticing Mason's uplifted eyebrows. "I'm the daughter of Robert Shelby, who was 18 years younger than Horace. My father and mother were killed in an automobile accident when I was 1 year old. Uncle Horace sent for me and raised me." "He's married?" "No, he's a widower, but he had a wonderful woman keeping house for him. She was like a mother to me." "Is she still with him?" "She died 2 years ago. Please, Mr. Mason, I feel that after you read that letter, you'll see the urgency of all this." Mason unfolded the letter addressed to Daphne Shelby, care of the steamship at Honolulu, and marked urgent. The letter began, "Daphne, dear, don't come home until you have done what I am asking. Don't let anyone know you have heard from me. I won't be able to meet the boat. Take a cab and go as fast as possible to the office of Perry Mason, the attorney. Get Perry Mason to go to the bank with you. Cash the enclosed check and have Perry Mason take charge of the money for you so that it can't possibly be found by anyone. After you've done this, come home and try to keep your temper. Be prepared for a shock. Tell Perry Mason to prepare a will leaving everything to you. I want a short will, and I want it prepared just as fast as he can do it. Have Mr. Mason come to the house when the will is ready for my signature. Tell him to have the necessary witnesses with him. The very first opportunity he's to hand me the will, I'll sign it and give it back to him to keep. No one except Mason must know he has a will ready for my signature or that it has been executed. The greatest secrecy is necessary. Please remember, Daphne, that no matter what happens, I love you very much indeed. Your Uncle Horace." Mason read the letter, frowning thoughtfully. "Sounds like an emergency. Do you have any idea what it is?" "The letter is all I know. It was sent to Honolulu. I'd been in Hong Kong for a 3-month vacation. They thought I needed a rest." "Who is the they?" "Brother Borden and his friend." "Borden Shelby?" Mason asked. "No, his name is Finchley. He's a half-brother. He and his wife came to visit Uncle Horace. He brought his friend, Ralph Exeter, and since Aunt Eleanor was there, it was suggested... Aunt Eleanor? Mason asked. That's Borden's wife. She said she'd take charge of things. They agreed that I was run down and needed a good long rest, that I was to go on an ocean voyage and forget about everyone except myself. And you've been away several weeks? Yeah, like 3 months. There was a check in this letter. She passed over a slip of paper. Mason looked at the check, suddenly straightened in the chair, frowned, looked at the check again, and said, "This check is for $125,000. I know, she said. I couldn't understand it at all. Mason pursed his lips. All right, let's go to the bank and cash this check. He has a balance sufficient to honor this check in his commercial checking account? That's right. There was around $145,000 in it when I left. Well, I keep his books and make out his checks, you know. But he signs them, Mason asked. Oh, yes. Mason gave Della Street a troubled glance. That 10:30 appointment, he said. Explain that I've been unavoidably detained for just a few minutes. You have some cash with you? He asked as they started for the door. Actually, I don't. Uncle Horace saw that I had traveler's checks when I started on the trip, but everything was a lot more expensive than we had expected. I had just enough money for taxi fare here. I see, Mason said. Your Uncle Horace is wealthy? Quite wealthy. He has some real estate holdings and stocks and bonds, and he keeps a large amount of liquid cash. They went down in the elevator, walked 2 blocks to the bank, and she took her place in the line. Mason stood beside her. The line thinned out at the window, and Daphne endorsed the check, then pushed it through the window. Why, hello, Daphne, the teller said. A deposit? No, I'm cashing this check. He looked at the check, paused in stiff, arrested motion, said, Excuse me for a minute, please. He left the window and a few minutes later was back with the cashier. The cashier handed back the check. I'm sorry, Daphne, he said, but there isn't any money to cover this check. No money? She asked. When I left, there was... The account has been cleaned out by a court order. It's been transferred to a conservator. I think you'd better see your uncle. The conservator asked for the balance of the account and wrote a check for the exact amount, transferring funds to an account in the name of Borden Finchley as conservator. When did all this happen? Perry Mason asked. Day before yesterday. I think I see, Mason said. Mason took Daphne's elbow. I think you better give me that check, Daphne, he said. And perhaps you better let me keep this letter for you. I think you better take a cab and go right out to the house and, if possible, talk with your Uncle Horace. If you can't talk with him, get in touch with me and... But why shouldn't I be able to talk with him? She asked. I don't know. I feel certain there's been a very drastic change in the situation while you were gone. And if for any reason you can't see your uncle, I want you to come right back to my office. Here's $20 for cab fare and expenses. You be sure to let us know what your situation is out there. It was just before Mason was leaving for lunch that Della Street said, She's back, Chief. Della brought Daphne into the office. Her eyes showed that she had been crying. She seemed numb with shock. Done something terrible, Mr. Mason. Who has? Borden Finchley, Ralph Exeter, and Eleanor. And what have they done? They've put Uncle Horace away. With that, she burst out crying. Now, take it easy, Mason said. Keep yourself in hand. What do you mean they put him away? They've had him declared incompetent or insane or something, and they've taken over the house, and they've locked up my room, and they've told me I have until tomorrow night to take all my things out. And they won't tell me what's happened. Mason picked up the telephone. Tell Paul Drake to come in, if you will, Gertie. I have a case for him. Mason said, You had letters from your uncle while you were gone? Oh, yes. What kind of letters? Nice, cheerful letters. And then when you got to Honolulu, you received this letter? Yes. Somehow the letter itself didn't mean so much to me. Uncle Horace was a little despondent, and he wanted me to have some money that, frankly, Mr. Mason, I thought it was some kind of a tax deal. I thought perhaps he was leaving me money in his will, but wanted me to have some money that wouldn't be subject to inheritance tax. Mason shook his head and said, "It would have been a transfer in contemplation of death. Now, he didn't send you that check for that purpose. The question is, why did he send it?" The lawyer broke off as Paul Drake's code knock sounded on the door. Paul Drake, tall, loose-jointed, deceptively mild of manner, gave a comprehensive grin by way of greeting. Mason said, "Paul, this is Daphne Shelby. Sit down, will you, while I find out just what has happened." Mason turned back to Daphne. "Tell me what happened when you went to the house." "I used my latchkey and ran right in and yelled, 'Woo-hoo, here I am!' No one answered. I looked right away into the room Uncle Horace has, and it was vacant. So then I ran to my room, and my room was locked. So I went looking for Uncle Borden or Ralph Exeter or Aunt Eleanor or somebody." "And who did you see?" "Aunt Eleanor. She said, 'Your Uncle Horace had to be taken away. He's in a home where he'll be given the best of care. And we suppose you, of course, will want to move out just as soon as you can get your things together. We'd like to have you out by tomorrow.'" "Go on," Mason said. "Well, I just looked at her in consternation and said, 'Boy, this is my home. I'm certainly not going to move out. I'm going to go see Uncle Horace and find out what this is all about.' Then suddenly Aunt Eleanor, she was just like cold granite. She said, 'Indeed, you're not going to stay here, young lady. You've sponged off your uncle long enough.' She said she had found out a lot about me since I'd left, and that her husband had been appointed conservator of Uncle Shelby's property, and he certainly intended to conserve the property and keep it from being wasted and dissipated or given to shrewd and designing persons. She said that she had evidence that I was intending to play Uncle Horace for a good thing and get all of his money, and that I had been too greedy even to wait for his death, but had been milking him right along, and that his housekeeper prior to her death had been milking him, and I'd been standing in with her and helping her to do it." "Then what?" "Well, by that time I was in tears. All I could think of was getting to you just as fast as I could because something horrible has happened. I know now that they are just schemers, that they moved in on Uncle Horace, took advantage of his generosity and good nature, and got me out of the place on the pretext that I needed a rest and a vacation, and then, just as soon as I was gone, they ganged up on Uncle Horace in such a way that they irritated him past all endurance. And Uncle Horace, of course, knowing that I needed a rest and a vacation, thought too much of me to tell me anything about it in his letters, but tried to act as though nothing was happening." Mason frowned thoughtfully and said, "The fact that your uncle sent you that check indicates that he thought he had a little more time than he did. Perhaps he felt you could take a plane back. In any event, they moved in more rapidly than he had anticipated and evidently had a court hearing." Mason turned to Della Street and said, "Della, get hold of the clerk of the court. Find out what department the Shelby hearing was in the day before yesterday, what judge granted the order, and the status of the case at the present time. Paul, I want you to find out where Horace Shelby is now. They probably moved him by ambulance. They'll have some doctor who may or may not be in on the conspiracy, and they probably have been using dope of some kind." Mason said to Daphne, "Have either of your uncles or your aunt any experience with medicine or any medical education?" "Why, yes," she said. "Aunt Eleanor was a trained nurse." "I see," Mason said grimly. "There are some drugs that can calm an elderly person when he gets excited, and there are some that can throw him entirely off his mental balance. I'm afraid you've been the victim of a rather deep-seated conspiracy. How much is your uncle worth? Do you have any idea?" "Well, at least $1 million. Paul, I want you to find out something else. I want you to get to his bank and find out what happened to the account of Horace Shelby." Della, who had been on the phone, said to Mason, "The order appointing Borden Finchley as conservator for the estate of Horace Shelby was made by Judge Ballinger day before yesterday. Borden Finchley qualified with a bond and immediately proceeded to take charge." "All right," Mason said. looking at his watch. Ring the secretary and see if I can make an appointment with Judge Ballinger for 1:30 if possible. Delastrete nodded, got busy on the telephone, and after a few moments said to Perry Mason, "He isn't expected in until just before court, but if you'll be there at 1:45, you can see him at least for a few minutes." Mason turned to look at Daphne Shelby's forlorn face. "Where's your baggage?" "Right in the taxicab. I know all this is horribly expensive. I'm living on borrowed money, and I guess I don't have a cent to my name." "It's all right," Mason said. "We'll see that you're taken care of temporarily. Della, get down and help Miss Shelby get a room in one of the downtown hotels. Go to the cash drawer and get a couple of $100 so that she'll have plenty of money, and leave her with enough to cover her expenses." "Oh, Mr. Mason," Daphne said, "I can't do that. I don't want to be a beggar." Mason smiled at her and said, "Quit crying, Daphne. If all beggars were as beautiful as you are, it would be a wonderful world. But you're not a beggar. You're a client, and I'm a lawyer. I can't pay you anything, and the way things look now, I don't know if I ever can. Tell me, if Uncle Horace left a will in my favor and they found it and just burned it up, what could be done?" Mason's face was stern. "Probably nothing, unless we can prove that such a will was in existence and they had burned it. Do you know if he made such a will?" "He told me that he was going to." "His letter indicates that he hadn't done it. I may as well prepare you for the worst, Daphne. You've been the victim of a very clever conspiracy. Also, it's a conspiracy that is as old as the hills. A wealthy man has relatives. Some of the relatives are close to him, some are not. The relatives who aren't close to him come to visit, get themselves established in the house, get rid of the relative who is close to the old man, then take advantage of the absence to claim the old man is mentally weak and subject to being exploited by shrewd and designing persons. However, you go with Delastrete. I'll fill Paul Drake in on some of the details, and before 2 o'clock I'll have seen Judge Ballinger. By that time we'll know a lot more about this." "But, Mr. Mason, I don't know how I'm ever going to pay you." "We'll work that out. You're a naive individual who has been the victim of a very great injustice. As a matter of principle, I'm going to try and rectify that." Mason followed Judge Ballinger to his chambers and watched while the judge put on his robe. "What's the problem?" Mason said, "I think perhaps I'm going to appear before you in your court on a contested matter, and I don't want to jeopardize your position or mine by discussing it. But I do want to get some history and, if possible, find out the reasoning back of an order you made in the case." "What's the case?" "The matter of the Horace Shelby conservator." "I handled that just a couple of days ago. Horace Shelby's an old man and he's confused. There's no question about that. And he was incoherent. He was excited, emotional, and apparently he'd made a check for $125,000 to some young woman who had been living in the house with him. Now, when you get a combination like that, you figure that something needs to be done. I appointed the conservator on a temporary basis with a statement that the court would review it at any time any additional facts came up. You feel you have some other facts?" "I think it's possible," Mason said. "Tomorrow morning at 9:30, too early for you to present the facts?" "I think not." Mason left Judge Ballinger's chambers, hurried back to his office, and entered through the reception room and went into the inner office. "How did you do, Della?" he asked. "Everything's okay," she said. "How did you do with Judge Ballinger?" Mason grinned and said, "Make an order shortening time and an order for an additional hearing tomorrow morning at 9:30. See that it gets served on opposing counsel. By the way, who is the attorney in this case?" "Denton, Middlesex, and Melrose," she said. "The junior partner, Darwin Melrose, was the one who appeared in court." Paul Drake's code knock sounded on the door. "I've got some evidence for you," Drake said. "What is it?" "Stanley Paxton, vice president of the bank, is pretty much worked up about this." "How well does he know Horace Shelby?" "He knows him mostly through his business transactions. Most of the personal contact he had was with Daphne." "What does he think of Daphne?" "Thinks she's one of the nicest young women he's seen in a long time. He thinks she has a good business head on her shoulders, and he thinks Horace Shelby is being railroaded into a position where he can't make a will that will stand up in court. And these relatives, the Finchleys, are moving in on the estate just for the purpose of seeing what they can get out of it. Paxton never heard of Borden Finchley or Eleanor Finchley or their friend Ralph Exeter until Daphne went on our trip. What about Ralph Exeter? Exeter seems to be a kind of barnacle on the ship, Drake said. I've been working at pretty high speed and I haven't had a chance to check everything I want. But apparently Finchley is indebted to Exeter for a rather large sum of money, and Exeter was pressing for collection. So Finchley brought him along to visit his rich brother so Exeter could see for himself. Finchley was going to run into a big sum of money one of these days. Mason's eyebrows lowered slightly as he became thoughtful. That, he said, would make quite a picture. And of course Exeter would have found that Horace Shelby intended to leave everything to Daphne, and a slow grin spread over Mason's face. Paul, he said, Exeter is the weak link in the chain. Get everything you can about Exeter's background. How did you get this information? There's a housekeeper who comes in 6 hours a day. The housekeeper heard Exeter telling Finchley that he didn't intend to sit on the sidelines and wait for somebody to die, that he wanted to get his money and get a turnover on it. Then they saw the housekeeper was standing by the doorway and they changed the subject abruptly. Mason nodded. Get Exeter's background, he said, and I don't care how many men you have to put on the job. Promptly at 9:30, Judge Ballinger ascended the bench and said, This is the matter of the conservator for the estate of Horace Shelby. The court stated at the time of making the order that the court might require additional evidence from time to time and was keeping the matter open. The court now wants to hear additional evidence. Mr. Mason, you have something to present? I have an affidavit, Mason said, from Daphne Shelby, the niece of Horace Shelby, stating that up to 3 months ago, when she was persuaded to take a long ocean voyage, Horace Shelby was in good mental health. I have an affidavit from Stanley Paxton of the Investors National Bank, where Horace Shelby has kept his account for many years, stating that Shelby is, in his opinion, thoroughly competent, that Shelby has shown good business judgment in handling all of his affairs, that Daphne Shelby has always had his best interests at heart and has made a very efficient manager. This affidavit further states that from the moment Daphne Shelby was persuaded to take a trip, Warden Finchley started nosing around, trying to get information about Shelby's personal financial affairs, trying to wheedle information out of the bank on the pretext that Shelby was ill. On the strength of the showing I am about to make, Your Honor, I suggest that the conservatorship be vacated, or if there is any necessity for a conservator, that Daphne Shelby, who has now returned from her trip, is much better qualified to act as conservator than is Warden Finchley. And as part of my showing, I desire to call Warden Finchley as a witness. Judge Ballinger frowned down at Finchley. Come forward and be sworn, Mr. Finchley. Warden Finchley, a stocky, rather thick-necked individual in his late 50s, held up his hand, took the oath, then occupied the witness stand and glowered at Perry Mason from rather small, cold blue eyes. You're a half-brother of Horace Shelby, and you were the moving spirit in asking for the appointment of a conservator? Mason asked. That's right, Mr. Finchley said. How long have you been visiting Shelby's house? About 6 months. Who is in the house at the present time? My wife, Eleanor, and Ralph Exeter. Ralph Exeter? Mason said, putting just the right element of apparent surprise in his voice. And is Ralph Exeter a relative of Horace Shelby? He is not. Close friend, perhaps. Not of Horace Shelby, he is a close friend of mine. He came to the Pacific coast with us. In fact, we were driving in his car. And you moved right in with Horace Shelby. We stopped to visit Horace, and when we saw that he was weakening mentally, we stayed long enough to size up the situation, until the situation was clarified. And what do you mean by until the situation was clarified? Until my brother wouldn't be taken advantage of by some young woman who was flaunting her charms, wheedling him for money, and finally using her powers of persuasion to get him to turn over to her $125,000 in the form of a check on his account, and asking her to go to an attorney to see that the money was handled in such a way that it couldn't be traced. I see, Mason said. You knew about that letter. I knew about it. And how did you find out about it? I saw the letter before it was mailed. And where did you see it? On my brother's desk. You thought the letter was addressed to you? No, I knew it was not addressed to me. Did you know to whom it was addressed? I most certainly did. And yet you read it, Mason asked. I read it, Finchley snapped. I called in my wife and had her read it, and right then and there I made up my mind that I was going to put a stop to having my brother's estate exploited by a total stranger. A total stranger? Mason asked. Are you referring to his niece, Daphne Shelby? I am referring to Daphne Raymond, who has been going by the name of Daphne Shelby, and who has represented herself to the bank and to my brother's business associates as being his niece. Actually, she is the daughter of his housekeeper and is no blood relation to Horace Shelby. Mason, veteran courtroom lawyer that he was, managed to keep his face from showing any element of surprise, but simply smiled and said, You have, I believe, heard your half-brother Horace Shelby repeatedly refer to Daphne as his niece. I have, Finchley said grimly, and every time I heard it I knew it was another indication of the fact that Horace's mind was weakening, and that the blandishments and wheedlings of this young woman have had their effect. But he is my uncle, Daphne exclaimed. Judge Ballinger tapped his pencil. You will be given ample opportunity to state your side of the case, young woman. He turned to the witness. You made certain statements, Mr. Finchley. I presume you are in a position to prove them? Certainly, Your Honor. I didn't care to bring this matter up because I didn't want to blacken the young woman's name. But of course, if she insists, we will have to get the facts before the court. Marie Raymond was a rather attractive woman who had an unfortunate love affair in Detroit. She came to Los Angeles looking for employment and was penniless, without friends, and had had but little experience and no training in any form of work. She advertised for a job as a housekeeper, and it happened that Horace Shelby saw that ad in the paper. Marie Raymond went to work for him. At the time, Marie Raymond rather suspected that she might be pregnant, but didn't know for sure. Later on, when she found out that she was pregnant, she confided in Horace Shelby. Shelby at that time was generous enough to suggest that she go ahead and have the child and continue her employment. Later on, when Horace Shelby's younger brother and wife were killed in an automobile accident, Horace Shelby suggested to Marie Raymond that they let the young Daphne think that she was the daughter of the deceased brother and his wife. In that way, Daphne would be given a name, and her illegitimacy would not be known to her schoolmates. You can prove all this? Judge Ballinger asked. Certainly I can prove it. I have letters written by Horace Shelby to my wife and me, letters in which he tells the whole story. I may state that Horace, while he never remarried after his wife died, has always been very susceptible to feminine charms. We have no reason to believe that there were any relations between Shelby and Marie Raymond, other than that she was persuaded to give her daughter a name, and that her daughter used the opportunity to insinuate herself into the affections of Horace Shelby. There is no question but that he regards her with deep affection, and there is no question in my mind but that this young woman, being fully aware of the situation, deliberately took advantage of it. Where is Marie Raymond now? She died a little over 2 years ago. It was at that time my wife and I decided to look into the situation because we felt that Horace was being imposed upon. And you wanted to protect your interests? Mason asked. Before Finchley could answer the question, Darwin Melrose got to his feet. If the court please, he said. We have been patient in this matter because we felt that, if possible, we would like to keep from bringing out matters which relate to the illegitimacy of this young woman. But in view of the circumstances which have now been disclosed, we respectfully submit that Daphne Raymond, sometimes known as Daphne Shelby, is a complete stranger to the controversy. That Perry Mason, as her attorney, has no status before the court and is therefore not entitled to question the court's decision or ask questions of the witnesses. Now, just a minute, Judge Ballinger said. This is certainly a peculiar situation. I'm going to ask this witness some questions myself. Judge Ballinger said to Borden Finchley, You realized, of course, that your brother had, as you express it, been victimized by this young woman? We thought it was a distinct possibility. And you realized that this young woman had, in your opinion, so insinuated herself into the affections of your half-brother that it was quite possible that he would make a will leaving her his entire estate. Finchley hesitated, shifted his eyes. We hadn't really considered that point. Perry Mason said to Daphne, Give me that letter. She handed him the letter which she had received from Horace Shelby. Mason said, In view of the fact that the witness has stated that he saw this letter which Daphne received in Honolulu, I think it is advisable for the court to read the letter. Judge Ballinger read the letter carefully, then turned to Borden Finchley. In this letter which I have in my hand, the letter which you have stated you read, the writer specifically states that he wants Perry Mason to draw up a will, leaving his entire estate to Daphne. Now then, in view of the fact that you have testified that you saw that letter, do you still insist that the thought never entered your mind that he might make a will disinheriting you? Well, of course, after I saw that letter, I realized there was that possibility, Finchley said. And it was after you saw that letter that you took steps to have yourself appointed as conservator. Well, I'd been thinking about it for a long time, and just answer the question yes or no. Yes. Judge Ballinger frowned. Where is Horace Shelby at the present time? He's in a private sanitarium, Finchley said. It became necessary to take him there. He is quite disoriented and rather violent, and we were simply not in a position to care for him. I'm going to look into this with great care. I'm continuing this matter until tomorrow at 2 o'clock. At that time, I want to have Horace Shelby in court. In the meantime, I'm going to have him examined by a doctor of my own choosing. What is the private sanitarium where he's now located? The Goodwill Sanitarium at El Mirar, Darwin Melrose said. Very well, Judge Ballinger said. Now, I want it understood that a physician appointed by the court will examine Mr. Shelby at the sanitarium. I want Mr. Shelby in court, and I want it understood that the court is not going to rule upon the objection disqualifying Perry Mason from appearing in this matter as attorney for Daphne Shelby, or Daphne Raymond, whatever her name may be, from appearing as an interested party until after I have given the matter further consideration. This matter is continued until tomorrow afternoon at 2 o'clock. Daphne clung to Mason's arm as a drowning person clutches a bit of floating wood. Mr. Mason, this is absolutely incredible. My whole world has come crashing down around my ears. I know, Mason said. I understand, but you're a big girl now. You're out in the world. You'll have to learn to take wallops and to come back fighting. I just can't understand how anything like this can take place. Our system of justice isn't absolutely perfect, Mason said. But the case isn't finished yet. They may have letters from your Uncle Horace telling them about your parentage, but those letters are hearsay except for the purpose of impeachment. You just sit tight and keep a good grip on yourself. I'm finished, illegitimate, I'm nobody. I'm going to be forced to go out in the world and try to make a living, and I haven't anything to offer. You can get a job that will keep you going if you have to, and if worse comes to worse. The worst has already come. I've been battered around. She suddenly squared her shoulders. No, I haven't either, and I'm not going to be a beggar. I'm going to make my own way in the world, but I'm going to see what I can do for Uncle Horace. I'm not going to let those horrid people manipulate him just any old way they want to. That's the spirit, Mason said. You endorsed that check for $125,000 when you tried to cash it at the bank? She nodded. Give me that check and the letter. I'm going to keep them in my office safe. You have enough money for your present needs? Thanks to your generosity. Mason left her and went to his office and shook his head at Della Street. The poor kid. I feel so sorry for her. What chances does she have? Delastrade asked. I don't know. If we can get the order appointing a conservator set aside, and if Horace Shelby is the type of man I think he is, we can do some good. But remember that Horace Shelby has been through a whole series of devastating experiences, and these have probably been complicated by some medication, which is contraindicated by his condition. There may be some permanent damage there. You can see their strategy, Mason went on. They got rid of Daphne for the longest possible period of time. While she was gone, they did everything they could to undermine the mental health of Horace Shelby. Then, when they didn't dare to wait any longer, they went to court. Of course, the fact that he was trying to give his niece, who it now seems is actually a stranger to the blood, $125,000, which virtually wiped out his checking account, was a big factor in the mind of the court. Delastrade nodded and said, Mr. Stanley Paxton is waiting in the office for you. Well, let's not delay seeing Mr. Paxton. His time is valuable. Delastrade went to the outer office, returning with Stanley Paxton. Paxton seated himself, ran his hand over his high forehead, looked shrewdly at Mason and said, We have had a little experience in these matters from time to time, and we can size people up. Our primary interest is protecting our clients. Horace Shelby is our client. As far as we are concerned, the conservator is a stranger, an interloper, an intruder. Under an order of the court, Mason pointed out. In dealing with the conservator, Paxton said, the general custom is for the conservator to file with us a certified copy of the order of court and have us transfer the account to the conservator. That custom wasn't followed in the present case, Mason asked. In the present case, I remember the wording of the court order very clearly because I had occasion to look it up. It said that Borden Finchley, as conservator, was to take possession of all funds on deposit in the Investors National Bank in the name of Horace Shelby, and safeguard those funds as conservator. An order was made to the bank, ordering the bank to turn over every credit existing in the bank as of the date of that order to the conservator. Then Borden Finchley, apparently not trusting us, drew a check on us for the exact amount of the balance on hand in the account of Horace Shelby, and opened a new account as conservator. He did that temporarily. He opened a new account as conservator, but within 2 hours went to another bank, opened an account in the name of Borden Finchley, conservator to the estate of Horace Shelby, and cleaned out the account. He realized that our attitude was somewhat unsympathetic. We considered Horace Shelby a rather elderly but very shrewd individual. What's your opinion of Daphne? She's a jewel. She's just a sweet, loyal girl who sacrificed her entire life for her uncle, and she did it out of affection and not because she was looking to see which side of the bread had the butter. Mason nodded, said after a moment, Well, the money was taken over under a court order, and it's out of the bank. That is true, Paxton said. It might have been better if Finchley had handled it in the ordinary way and simply taken over everything in Shelby's account at the bank, and served us with an order that only the signature of the conservator was to be recognized. What do you mean? Mason asked. Simply this. Yesterday afternoon, a deposit of $50,000 was made to the credit of Horace Shelby. What? It was a payment due under a contract of purchase, and the contract provided that the money could be paid by making a deposit to the credit of Horace Shelby in our bank. Our grant deed had already been executed by Horace Shelby and placed in escrow with the title company with instructions that whenever the purchaser showed a deposit slip showing that the final $50,000 had been paid to the account of Horace Shelby at our bank, the deed was to be delivered. The purchaser knew nothing of the appointment of a conservator, and insisted on depositing the money to the account of Horace Shelby and receiving a duplicate deposit slip, which he took to the escrow company. Now then, we're in a peculiar situation. If we notify Borden Finchley of this extra $50,000, He will simply have another order prepared and have that account transferred to his name. But do we need to notify him? Certainly, Mason said. I think it's your duty to notify him. Paxton got to his feet. Well, he said, his manner showing disappointment, I was hoping that perhaps you could suggest some other means of handling it. Mason shook his head. That's the only ethical thing to do. Go to the bank and write a letter. In fact, I'll walk down to the bank with you. I have some business in that direction. If Horace Shelby knew about this money, I think he'd contrive in some way to take care of Daphne. I suppose so. How's my credit at your bank, by the way? Your credit? Paxton asked in surprise. Why, absolutely A1. I'd like to borrow $75,000. Why, I think that could be arranged. You have some security? No security. I would give my note. Paxton started to shake his head, then frowned. How long would you want the money, Mr. Mason? About 10 minutes. Paxton looked at him incredulously. $75,000 for 10 minutes? Yes. Good heavens, what do you intend to do with it? Mason grinned. I thought I would deposit it to the account of Horace Shelby. Are you crazy? Suddenly he stopped dead in his tracks, regarded Mason in a bewildered manner, then broke out laughing. Come on, let's go to the bank just as fast as we can. They entered the bank. Paxton called in the secretary. He said, If you don't mind, Mr. Mason, I'll dictate a letter to Borden Finchley telling him. I think, Mason interrupted, the better procedure would be to make the letter to Horace Shelby care of Borden Finchley Conservative. Paxton grinned. I get the point. He turned to the secretary. Take a letter to Horace Shelby, care of Borden Finchley Conservative. Dear Mr. Shelby, the $50,000 final payment on the purchase of the Broadway property was deposited to your account by the purchaser, who took a duplicate deposit slip to deliver to the escrow department. That money is now on deposit in your name. Very truly yours, etc. Mason nodded. Now, could we visit the loan department? I think, Mr. Mason, under the circumstances, I'll okay this loan myself. I'll make it for 30 days. Any time you like. I won't need it that long, but if you'd like to have your record so show, it will be for that period. Paxton made out the note. Mason signed it. How do you want this? I think under the circumstances, cash would be preferable. 75 $1,000 bills. Paxton went to the vault and returned with the 75 $1,000 bills. Mason put the money in his pocket, walked out to the window of a teller, made out duplicate deposit slips, and shuffled his way along in the line of customers. When he reached the window, he pulled out the 75 $1,000 bills and the duplicate deposit slip. Please deposit this to the account of Horace Shelby, he said. The teller looked at the $75,000 in surprise. Cash deposit for $75,000? he asked. Exactly, Mason said. The teller stamped and signed the duplicate deposit slips. Now then, Mason said, taking the endorsed check of Daphne Shelby from his pocket. I have a check here that I would like to cash, a check for $125,000. You want to cash a check for $125,000? the teller asked. That's right, Mason said. The teller looked at the check in frowning incredulity. Then, suddenly, a light dawned on his face. He left the window and was back in a few moments. It happens, he said, that there is just enough money in the account to pay this check. How do you want this, Mr. Mason? In $1,000 bills, Mason said. The teller opened his drawer, carefully counted out the $75,000 that Mason had deposited, then counted out 20,000 more bills, summoned the messenger to go to the vault, and said, Just a moment, please, and a few minutes later handed Mason the balance of the money in $1,000 bills. Thank you, Mason said. He put the money in his pocket, walked over to the enclosure in which Stanley Paxton had his desk, and said, Mr. Paxton, I borrowed $75,000 from the bank a short time ago. Yes, indeed. It was a short-term 30-day note on your personal security. I find that I have no further use for the money and would like to pay off the note. Wow, that's most unusual. I know it is. As I figure the interest for 1 day, it amounts to about $12.32. The lawyer gravely put $75,000 bills, $10 bill, to $1 bills, and 32 cents on the banker's desk. Just a moment, please. Paxton took the money, put it in the drawer of his desk, picked up an inter-office telephone, and said, "Send me in the Perry-Mason note for $75,000, please. Mark it paid." "I know, it just came in. Mark it paid." After some 3 minutes, a young man approached the desk with a promissory note. "Here you are. Now I have one other request. I have $50,000 in cash. I would like to buy 10 cashier's checks for $5,000 each, payable to Daphne Shelby. If you can wait here for just a few more minutes," Paxton said. He took the $50,000, left his desk, and within a matter of 15 minutes returned with the 10 cashier's checks. "Thank you very much," Mason said. The banker stood up. "I've shaken hands with you once, Mr. Mason. I'm going to shake hands with you again. When I really violated a confidence to give you information in your office, I was hoping against hope that you'd find some way of handling the matter, and then I felt my hopes dashed to the ground. I realize now that I should have had more confidence." The lawyer, with the 10 cashier's checks in his inside pocket, left the bank, went to Daphne Shelby's hotel. "Daphne," he said when he confronted the young woman, "you're no longer a beautiful beggar." "What do you mean?" she asked. Mason took the 10 cashier's checks from his pocket. She looked at each one incredulously. "What in the world?" "Just endorse this one check, pay to the order of Perry Mason." "At your fee?" "We're not talking about a fee yet. I'm having you endorse this so I can get $5,000 in cash and send it over to you. That's all you should have on your person at the present time. In fact, you better get traveler's checks for about $4,500 with it. The other checks you should hold against a rainy day." Mason had been back in his office less than an hour when Paul Drake's code knock sounded on the door. "I've got Ralph Exeter pegged." "What about him?" Mason asked. Drake said, "Exeter's real name is Cameron. Bosley Cameron. He's from Las Vegas. He's a gambler. He's holding Borden Finchley's IOUs for over $150,000. Cameron became involved himself, and until he can get the money on those IOUs, Cameron can't get back in good standing with his own crowd. So Cameron is hiding out. That's why he's taken the name of Ralph Exeter of Boston." Mason said, "That's darn good work, Paul. You did a wonderful job. I just happened to cross the back trail of people who are trying to find Cameron. I traced the license plates on Exeter's car. The person who was registered as owning the car went to Las Vegas, became involved in a gambling game, and this man, Cameron, to whom he owed a little over $1,000, offered to trade automobiles and give him the difference. Once I had that lead, I did a little telephoning in Las Vegas and found that Cameron got wiped out in a poker game and had some IOUs floating around. He told friends that he had a pigeon who owed him $150,000, and that pigeon had it all made, but it was going to take a little while to cash in. That he was going to ride hard on his pigeon until the money came in. At first, the people who held Cameron's paper were willing to wait, but now they're getting a little restless, and they'd like very much to know where Cameron is." Mason grinned and said, "Now then, Paul, we're beginning to get someplace. Who's the doctor the court is appointing?" "Dr. Grantland Alma." Della Street immediately started rifling through the pages of the phone book, then furnished the supplemental information. "Here he is. His office is 602 Center Building, and his phone is Levine 23681. And," Mason said, "any attempt to influence him will make him mad, but there's no reason why I, as an attorney, can't try to see Horace Shelby before the doctor does." He You stand absolutely no chance, Waldrake said. Mason grinned. If they'd got him shut off from all of his friends, it might be a good thing to know. Give the doctor's nurse a ring, Della. Della Street put through the call and nodded to Mason. Hello, this is Perry Mason, the attorney. I'd like very much to talk to Dr. Alma. If that's not possible, I'd like to ask a question which he could answer. It's a matter of some urgency. The feminine voice at the other end of the line said, Well, if this is his nurse, perhaps you'd better give me a question. The doctor is busy now and has an office full of patients. Mason said, Dr. Alma, who's been appointed by Judge Ballinger to examine Horace Shelby sometime before a court hearing which is to take place. Oh, I'm sure the doctor wouldn't discuss that with you or with anyone. I don't want him to. I'm simply trying to find out if it would interfere with the doctor's plans in any way if I went out to the Goodwill Sanitarium to visit Mr. Shelby. Oh, well, I'm sure it wouldn't, the nurse said. Just so you don't do anything to upset or alarm him. You're one of the attorneys in the case? In the general case, yes. What room is he in, by the way? He's in one of the isolation units, I believe. Just a minute. Unit 17. Thank you very much. Please tell Dr. Alma I called. I will. Well, Mason said, grinning as he hung up the phone, if you want information, the way to go about it is to get it openly. The Goodwill Sanitarium and Rest Home in El Mirar was apparently the combination of a reconverted motel and a large, old-fashioned three-story dwelling on an adjoining lot. Perry Mason noticed a sign on the gate reading, Wanted, young, well-adjusted woman with agreeable personality for general work. There was a similar sign in a frame on the side of the office door. Since these signs had been hand-lettered by a professional, it was apparent that the institution had quite a turnover in domestic help and experienced considerable trouble in getting replacements. Mason entered the office. A middle-aged woman came hurrying through a door which opened from the back of the office. What can I do for you? She asked Mason. You have a Horace Shelby here? Mason said. Instantly the woman stiffened. Her eyes grew wary. What about it? She asked. I want to see him. You're a relative? I'm a lawyer. It's past visiting hours today, she said. And when are they? 2 to 3 in the afternoon. You mean I can't see him until tomorrow afternoon? I'm not certain you can see him then. You're going to have to talk to Doctor. He's been having a little trouble. Doctor who? Dr. Baxter, Tillman Baxter. He runs the place. He's a medical doctor? He has a license to run the place, she said. That's all I know, and I don't think it's going to do you any good to come back. I don't think Horace Shelby is going to be in any condition to receive visitors. She abruptly turned her back on him and walked through the door leading from the office into the back room. Mason turned away, made a quick survey of the place, and walked back to where he had parked his car. A man was standing by the car. You're the court-appointed doctor? The man asked. What court-appointed doctor? The Shelby case. Why? Mason asked. I want to talk to you. Are you the court-appointed doctor? No, but I'm Perry Mason, the attorney. Now, why did you want to talk with the... The man didn't wait for him to finish the sentence, but walked rapidly to a car which was parked ahead of Mason's, jumped in, said something to the driver of the car, and the car took off down the street. Mason tried to make out the license number, but the car had been parked too far ahead. He could see that it was a Nevada license, and that was all. The lawyer drove back to his office. There's a call from Dr. Alma, Della Street told him. Mason picked up the telephone. Hello, he said. Perry Mason talking. Dr. Grantland Alma, Mason. I understand you wanted to talk with me? Yes. I understand you've been appointed by Judge Ballinger to talk with Horace Shelby and make an appraisal of his physical and mental condition. Do you expect to see Horace Shelby soon? I've told the sanitarium I'll be there at 10 o'clock in the morning. I've told them I want him to have no sedation after 8 o'clock tonight, that I want a complete chart, showing every bit of medication that has been given, and that I don't want anyone from the sanitarium present when I examine him." "Thank you, Doctor. I can see why the court decided to appoint you as the examining physician. I just wanted to ask you if ample precautions would be taken to see that the patient had a fair chance." "I know all about you and your reputation, Mr. Mason. I can tell you in confidence that the sanitarium gave me an argument when I said I didn't want any medication after 8 tonight. They told me the patient was restless, highly irritable, unable to sleep, and that he would have to be given heavy sedation. I don't mind telling you, Mr. Mason, that I'm going to check this thing carefully." "Thanks a lot," Mason said. "I just wanted to find out what you had in mind." "Don't worry, Mason. I'm going to be fair, but I'm going to be very, very thorough." The lawyer hung up and said to Della Street, "I wouldn't be too surprised if tomorrow wasn't a day with plenty of action, as far as the sanitarium is concerned." Perry Mason entered the office and told Della, "Give Daphne a ring." Della said into the telephone, "Miss Daphne Shelby, please. She's in room 718. She held the phone for a while, then frowned, looked at her watch, and said to Mason, "There's no answer." "All right, leave a message for her. Tell her to call Mr. Mason when she comes in." Della duly transmitted the message, then hung up the telephone. "I have an idea she slept late and is in the dining room eating breakfast," Mason said. "Or perhaps out shopping," Della said. "After all, she came into quite a windfall thanks to your financial skullduggery." "No skullduggery about it," Mason said, grinning. The telephone rang. Dr. Alma's heavy, masculine voice came over the wire. "Mr. Mason," he said, "I'm down here at the so-called Goodwill Sanitarium and Rest Home. As you know, I came here under court order to examine Horace Shelby." "What about him?" Mason asked. "Nothing's happened to him, has it?" "A good deal has happened to him," Alma said. "Good heavens, he isn't dead." "We don't know," Alma said. "He isn't here." "I'll be right out," Mason said. Mason slammed the telephone receiver, grabbed his hat, said to Della Street, "Call Paul Drake. Tell him to take his car and join me at the Goodwill Sanitarium in El Mirar." It took Mason 34 minutes fast driving to reach El Mirar. Mason hurried down the walk to Unit 17, a small cottage standing in a row of similar cottages. The lawyer heard angry voices from inside. He walked up to the porch and jerked the door open. The tall man who whirled to face the lawyer was somewhere in his 40s, alert, slightly stooped, almost as tall as Mason, and quite obviously very indignant. The other, an older man, was a head shorter, an apologetic, cowed individual who was very much on the defensive. "Dr. Alma?" the lawyer asked of the tall one. "You're Perry Mason," he said. The two men shook hands. "And this is Dr. Tillman Baxter." I'm licensed to run this rest home," Baxter said. "Doubtless you are," Dr. Alma said. "But how much longer that condition is going to exist is anyone's guess." Mason looked around the room, taking mental inventory of an iron-frame hospital bed, washstand, chest of drawers and a mirror, worn linoleum on the floor, drab lace curtains on the window. "Where does this door go?" Mason asked. "The bathroom," Dr. Baxter said. Mason jerked the door open, looked at the old-fashioned bathtub, the toilet, crowded cubicle, the mirror over the shallow medicine cabinet. "This other door?" The closet. That's where the patient keeps his clothes." "I looked in there," Dr. Alma said. "The clothes are gone." "The man had virtually no personal possessions," Dr. Baxter said. "He had virtually nothing except the clothes he wore when he was received." "A man going to a sanitarium carries at least a suitcase of clothes," Mason said. "Pajamas, underwear, shirts, socks, handkerchiefs." A normal man does," Dr. Baxter said. "And Horace Shelby wasn't normal?" "By no means. He was irritable, nervous, excited, aggressive. He refused to cooperate." Mason suddenly backed into the room, picked up one of the straight-back chairs, carried it into the closet, climbed up on it, and reached back into the dark recesses of the closet shelf. "What are these?" he asked, bringing out a set of straps. "Oh, we use them to restrain patients who are inclined to become physically unmanageable. They use them in all hospitals which treat mental cases." "In other words, you strap a man in bed, well, when his condition requires. And Horace Shelby was strapped in bed." I'm not sure. He may have been at one time. You can see by yourself that the straps have been removed, Mr. Mason. They've been cut with a sharp knife." "Dear me, so they have," Dr. Baxter exclaimed. "A man who has been strapped in bed and has no knife can't very well cut the straps which are holding him." "You better be in court at 2 o'clock this afternoon," Dr. Alma said. "I think Judge Ballinger is going to want to talk with you." "I can't be in court. All of us are doing double duty at the present time." Paul Drake entered the room. Mason said, "Dr. Grantland Alma, Mr. Drake, and Dr. Baxter." "As far as I'm concerned," Dr. Alma said, "Horace Shelby is gone, and I don't know where he went, how he went, or who took him." "He took himself," Dr. Baxter said. "You believe that?" Dr. Alma asked. "Yes. You just come into court and say that you thought he was aged, infirm, senile, and unable to take care of himself, and let's see what the court has to say." "I can't see where there's anything to be gained by staying here," Mason said. He moved to the door, led Drake to one side. "You have the car that has the telephone in it?" Drake nodded. "All right. Put men on the job. I want everyone you can pick up put under 24-hour surveillance." "You mean everyone?" "Exeter, Finchley, Mrs. Finchley, Dr. Baxter. Stick around and see if you can get a clue as to how Horace Shelby left here. I have a hunch someone pulled a fast one. I noticed yesterday that there were 2 signs asking for help to run the place. Those signs have now been taken down. That means that somebody applied for the job last night and got the job, probably a night job. See if you can find out anything about that person, because that person could well have been a plant. Someone that Warden Finchley put in here to get Horace Shelby out of sight so that Dr. Alma couldn't examine him." Promptly at 2 o'clock, Judge Ballinger took his place on the bench. "This is the time heretofore fixed for a continued hearing in the matter of the conservator for the estate of Horace Shelby. I see that Dr. Grantland Alma, the physician appointed by the court to examine Horace Shelby, is in court. Did you see Horace Shelby, Doctor?" "I did not. He was no longer at the so-called sanitarium and rest home." "Where is he?" "I don't know." "How did this happen?" "Again, I don't know. I have my own idea from certain things I discovered." "What things?" "We found evidence that Horace Shelby had been strapped to a bed. We found that the institution keeps no charts on patients, no hospital records. I tried to find out whether Mr. Shelby had in some way made an escape by himself, or whether he had been removed by people in the institution who wanted to keep me from examining him." "Does anyone know where Horace Shelby is at the present time?" "And I'm asking this question particularly of counsel. I intend to hold counsel responsible for the actions of their clients in this matter." Melrose said, "I want to assure the court that I have no idea where Horace Shelby is, and my client, Warden Finchley, and his wife, Eleanor, have assured me that they have no information. I understand, however, that Daphne Shelby, the young woman who tried to establish a relationship, is absent from her hotel. And despite the fact that she knew that this hearing had been continued to this hour, she is not present, and I feel further that her counsel doesn't know where she is." Judge Ballinger frowned. "Mr. Mason?" he asked. Mason got to his feet slowly, turned as he heard the door open, and said, without changing his expression by so much as the flicker of an eyelash, "Since Daphne Shelby has just walked into the court, I suggest that she can speak for herself." Daphne came rushing forward. "Oh, Mr. Mason, I'm so sorry. I got caught in a traffic jam and—" "That's all right," Mason said. "Just be seated." Judge Ballinger said, "The court isn't going to try a moot case. If it is impossible for Dr. Alma to examine Horace Shelby, the court is going to continue the case until he can examine the man. If it should appear that Shelby was spirited out of the sanitarium so that Dr. Alma couldn't examine him, the court is going to take very drastic steps. The matter will be continued until next Wednesday afternoon at 4 o'clock. Mason beckoned to Daphne to join him and once more led the way into the witness room. "Gotta keep in touch with me, Daphne," he said sternly. "My office repeatedly, as called, left messages at the hotel," and her eyes refused to meet his. "Yes, I know." "What have you been up to?" Her eyes, wide, innocent, and naive, raised to his. "What do you mean, what have I been up to?" "You know that your uncle has disappeared from the sanitarium," she said bitterly. "It's no surprise to me. They didn't dare to let a physician appointed by the court examine him." "You said you'd been having trouble with traffic. Were you riding with somebody?" "No. Oh, no. I was using a friend's car." "What friend?" "Uncle Horace." "Why, Finchley took over his car at the same time he took over the bank account and all that." "Well, this was one that Mr. Finchley didn't know about." Mason said, "Look here, young lady, I've got to get back to my office. I think you'd better come up there in about an hour and let's find out a little more about this." The court attaché said, "There's a telephone call for you, Mr. Mason." "Excuse me for a minute, Daphne." Mason followed the attaché into the courtroom. Mason picked up the telephone and said, "Hello," and heard Paul Drake's voice sharp with excitement. "Did Daphne show up in court, Perry?" "That's right." "Tell you anything about where she'd been?" "No." "Let her go. Tell her to get in touch with you in the morning." "She's acting rather strangely, Paul, and she says there's another automobile that Finchley doesn't know about." "I'll say there is," Drake interrupted. "There's a lot no one knows about. Now, I haven't time to explain, but for heaven's sake, let her go. I want her on her way." "Wait a minute," Mason said. "I'm beginning to get the glimmer of an idea. You checked on the tip I gave you that some woman might have applied for a job and got a job at the sanitarium last night. Is there any chance that—" "There's all the chance in the world. Meet me in your office and don't let Daphne know you're suspicious." The lawyer hung up the telephone and returned to the witness room. There was no sign of Daphne. Paul was waiting in Mason's office when the lawyer fitted his latchkey to the door of the private office and entered. "What happened, Paul?" "Yesterday afternoon, a girl who answers the description of Daphne Shelby stopped a brand-new-looking car in front of the sanitarium and said she'd noticed the sign that they wanted domestic help. The girl had been on the shift from 10 o'clock at night till 7 o'clock in the morning and quit, and our friend Dr. Baxter was desperate. This girl, well, I'm going to call her Daphne because I'm satisfied that's who she was, said that she'd be back at 10 o'clock to start work. She gave the name of Eva Jones and said that she'd had some nursing experience caring for aged people. She worked during the entire night. Dr. Baxter got up and checked her a couple times, and everything seemed to be running fine. The new girl was last seen about 5:45 in the morning when the cook greeted her. For a while, everybody was busy with breakfast. And then they went into Unit 17 to make up the bed and see what could be done for the occupant who had been giving them a lot of trouble. They found the bed empty. Horace Shelby had vanished, and the new girl had vanished. Now then, Perry, you can put two and two together. She bought a car. She went out. She parked it at the sanitarium. She didn't duck out during the night because that would have been too much of a coincidence. She waited until the cook came on duty in the morning and then slipped in, cut the straps that were holding Horace Shelby to the bed. She got Shelby's clothes on him, got him across the yard, through the gate, and into the automobile. Mason, who had seated himself with one hip on the corner of his desk, one leg swinging back and forth, frowned thoughtfully. "Our little naive, unsophisticated girl seems to have a head on her shoulders and a lot of initiative. What's the court going to say about all that?" Drake asked. "Well, that depends. If Horace Shelby is being railroaded into incompetency, that's one thing. On the other hand, if Borden Finchley was acting in good faith and believed that Daphne had been wheedling Horace and insinuating herself into his good graces so that she could make away with a large chunk of money, that's something else. Once Horace Shelby is interviewed by Dr. Alma, he'll tell a true story of how he was treated at the sanitarium. If the conspirators are railroading him, they can't afford to have that happen. They'll put a stop to it at all costs. What do you mean, at all costs? Delastrete asked. Murder, Mason said. But how will murder help? Well, murder in itself won't help. They'll have to commit a murder that they can blame on Daphne Shelby. Their story will be very simple, that Daphne got Horace out of the sanitarium, that she got him to make a will leaving everything in her favor, that he died during the night. His death will seem to be from natural causes, but those causes were helped along by Daphne. We got to find Daphne in order to protect her, from herself and from the others. Drake said, I've got men shadowing Daphne from the time she left the courthouse. We've got the license number of the automobile she's driving, and we should know where she's holed up within the next few minutes. The unlisted telephone rang. Delastrete answered it, said, It's for you, Paul. Drake picked up the instrument, said, Drake speaking. Yes. Hello, Judd. What? How did that happen? Drake listened for a full minute, then said, Where are you now? Okay, wait there for instructions. Drake hung up the telephone, turned to Mason and said, I'm sorry, Perry, but they lost her. Lost her, Perry Mason exclaimed. Well, they didn't lose her. She gave them the slip. She knew she was being tailed and was smart enough that she never let on. Now, Mason said, Daphne has really got herself in a jam. If she isn't on the square, the court is going to feel that she's deliberately interfering with the process of the court. And if she is acting in good faith and Ward and Finchley can find her before we do, she's in danger, and Horace is in danger. Paul, round up every man you can get on short notice. Cover the motels at El Mirar. See if you can't find Daphne Shelby's new car parked in front of one of the units. It was just as Perry Mason and Delastrete were closing the office that Paul Drake's code knock sounded on the door. What gives? Mason asked. Your hunch paid off, Drake told him. I started men looking for automobiles parked in motels around El Mirar. We finally located the car at the Serene Slumber Motel. She's in Unit 12, and she's all alone. And what has happened to Horace Shelby? Delastrete asked. Mason said, She may have him hidden out. He's probably in another unit. Not in the Serene Slumber, Drake interrupted. My men are thorough enough for that. They checked every unit and quizzed the people who are running the place. I'll tell you what you do, Paul. Keep a tail on Daphne and let's see if she isn't keeping him hidden in some other motel. Now what would be the object of that? Drake asked. Darned if I know, Mason said. But I have a hunch she's trying to cover a trail so that if anyone locates her, they can't automatically put their hands on Horace Shelby. Come on, Paul. Put your men on the job, leave word where you can be reached. Have a cocktail and a nice thick steak. They went to the Purple Lion restaurant, which was one of Mason's favorites, and was within easy cab distance of the office. They finished the cocktails, and after a few minutes the waitress brought them the steaks. The head waiter approached the table. One of you is Mr. Paul Drake. I have a call for you. The receiver made noises. Drake listened for a while, said, Just a moment. He turned to Mason and said, Tale is reporting on Daphne Shelby. She went to a Chinese restaurant and ordered food to take out. She took the food to the Northern Lights Motel, parked the car directly in front of Unit 21, gave a perfunctory knock on the door, then opened the door, which was unlocked, and went in with the food. Then what? Closed the door. She's there now. There's a phone booth at the corner. My man is in the phone booth. Tell him to keep an eye on the situation, Mason said. I want to know what time she went in. I want to know what time she comes out, and I want to know where she goes when she leaves there. Drake relayed Mason's instructions into the telephone. They had a leisurely dessert. Now what? Drake asked when they had finished. Call your office. Tell him we're on our way back, Mason said. They dropped Paul Drake at his office. Mason and Delastrete went on down to the lawyer's office. You're worried about the case, aren't you? Della asked. Mason nodded. My client has started taking shortcuts. I don't like that. She isn't confiding in me, and I don't like that. The fact that she's taking such elaborate precautions to keep Horace Shelby out of circulation either means that he's pretty far out in left field, or that both of them are afraid the Finchleys are going to put him back in that sanitarium and restrain him with force. As soon as we're dead certain we have Horace Shelby located, I'm going to get in touch with Dr. Alma and arrange for an interview. If Shelby is okay, I'm going to see what we can do for Daphne. If he isn't, if he's really in need of having somebody look after him, then of course we're in a different situation. However, I'm going to try and get evidence that will make the court change his order in regard to Borden Finchley. I think we'll have some other conservator. Mason walked around the office aimlessly, working off his restlessness while he was waiting. The silence of the night settled on the big office building. The sound of the unlisted telephone ringing shattered the silence. Only 3 people had the number of that unlisted telephone: Perry Mason, Della Street, and Paul Drake. So Mason scooped up the instrument and said sharply, "Yes, Paul." Drake said, "My man just telephoned. She's back at the Serene Slumber Motel. He's at a phone now, waiting for instructions. Tell him to wait until we get there. Unless, of course, she goes out. If she does, he's to follow her and report at the earliest opportunity. We can't afford to lose her now. Your car or mine?" "Both," Mason said. "We may want to separate later." They rode down in the elevator, crossed to the parking lot, got in their respective cars, and Drake led the way out of the freeway, then along to the turnoff at El Mirar. Drake blinked his brake lights a couple of times to call Mason's attention to the illuminated sign that read, "Serene Slumber Motel." Mason and Della walked in to join Paul Drake, who by the time they had parked was standing close to the shadowy figure of a tall young man. "I think you know Jim Inskip," Drake said. Inskip bowed. "I've met you before, Mr. Mason. I'm very glad to meet you, Miss Street. Our party's in Unit 12. Car's here. You can see the lights on in the unit. That's the one with the light right over there." "What do we do, Perry?" Drake asked. Mason said, "Inskip is to stay with Daphne Shelby no matter what. If we come out and drive away, Inskip is not to come anywhere near us, but is to sit in his car and wait, because Daphne might be smart enough to turn out the light and look out the back window. We'll arrange our communication system by phone later on." "You want me to come with you?" Drake asked. "I think I do." The 3 of them separated from Inskip, moved around to the walk, which went around to the front of the units, and Mason tapped gently at the door of number 12. After a moment, the knob turned, the door opened a crack, and Daphne Shelby said, "Who is it? What do you want?" Mason said, "Good evening, Daphne." Mason held the door open while Della Street entered. Daphne was wide-eyed with surprise. "You?" she exclaimed. "How in the world did you get here?" Mason said, "Daphne, I want to ask you some questions. Anything that you say to me is privileged communication as long as only you, Della, and I are in the room. But with Paul Drake, a detective, present, the communication is no longer privileged. Drake can be called as a witness. Now, if there are any questions I ask which are going to embarrass you, or anything you want to tell me which you don't want known, just speak up and Paul Drake will step outside. Is that clear?" She nodded wordlessly. "All right," Mason said. "Just what do you think you're accomplishing?" "I'm trying to save Uncle Horace's sanity," she said. "He would have gone stark, staring, raving mad if I hadn't got him out of that place. Or did you know that I got him out of that place?" "I knew. You went out to the sanitarium, you saw from the sign that they were very anxious to get someone to do domestic work. You applied for the job." She nodded. "You bought a new car." Again she nodded. "What happened?" "It took me a couple of hours before I dared slip into Unit 17 where they were keeping Uncle Horace. There was that poor man strapped to a bed, and the straps were stretched so tight that they were holding him motionless." "What was his mental condition?" "Well, what would your mental condition be in a situation like that? He was wild and disheveled. Did he recognize you?" "I don't think I better talk any more about that phase of it until you and I can be alone, Mr. Mason." "All right. Why didn't you keep Uncle Horace here with you?" But it would be safer to park him off by himself. What's his mental condition now? He's on the verge of a complete nervous breakdown because of the things he's had to put up with. He's going to stay where he is until he's got his nerves back in shape and until we can get Finchley shown up for the type of man he is. Uncle Horace tells me that no sooner had I left for the Orient than they started doing all sorts of things that they knew would irritate and annoy him. They wouldn't let him do what he wanted to do. He thinks Aunt Eleanor was giving him some drug that overstimulated him. He couldn't sleep, and when he told her he couldn't sleep, she said that she'd give him some sleeping pills. Within a week or 10 days, he was so dependent on those sleeping pills that he had to have them in order to have a night's sleep. Didn't it occur to him that Mrs. Finchley was deliberately drugging him? Not at the time. She handed him a great line of talk about how he was upset because he was accustomed to having me around. Finally, he realized what they were trying to do. That was when he wrote that letter to me. Just what was his idea in writing that letter? He wanted me to get enough money out of the bank account so that if they did start proceedings for a guardianship, he wouldn't be absolutely helpless. Just what are your plans now? I was intending to get in touch with you. You took long enough doing it. Well, I had to make arrangements to see that Uncle Horace would be safe and comfortable. Where is he? She clamped her lips together and shook her head. Mason smiled. You're not telling me? No, I'm not going to tell a soul. That's why I have him where people can't get at him until he's ready to step into court and go in there fighting. And you gave him money? Mason asked. I gave him $40,000 of his money. I bought the car, and I'm keeping enough money so I can do the things that have to be done. Did you, Mason asked, tell him about the evidence that had been brought out in court that you weren't actually related to him? I don't think I want to talk about that for a while, but I can tell you this. He's made his will now. Mason's eyes narrowed. I was afraid of that. You're playing right into their hands. They claimed that if you could ever get him where he was under your control, you'd have him make a will and you'd get his property. But this was his own idea. He insisted on it. Who has it? I do. Give it to me. She hesitated a moment, then opened her purse, took out a folded document, and handed it to Mason. Mason read the will. You better let me keep this, Daphne. Now then, let's go and see Horace Shelby. She shook her head. I am not going to tell you where he is. Suppose, Mason said, that you just take a little ride with me and we'll go see him. She smiled. And you can't bluff me, Mr. Mason. I know you regard me as a naive child, but I'm not as green as some people think. I'll say you're not, Mason said. Well, get your hat and coat and we'll take a little ride. I'll ride with you, she said, but I'm not going to give you any information about where Uncle Horace is. He needs rest. You just can't imagine what a devastating experience this has been for him. All right, let's get in the car. Perhaps you better follow us in your car, Paul. Will do, Paul said. Mason, Della Street, and Daphne got into the front seat. With Paul Drake following, they drove down the thoroughfare, cruised past the Northern Lights Motel. The young woman kept looking straight ahead, not even her eyes turned as they cruised slowly past the motel. Paul Drake snapped the headlights on and off, gave 2 quick taps on the horn button. Mason swung to the curb, rolled down the window on his side, and waited. Drake's car pulled alongside. Cops, Drake said. The other end of the motel. 2 cars. What do we do? Mason said. We pull around the corner and wait. You go ask questions. As the detective pulled away, Mason turned to Daphne and said, Finchley's found out where your uncle is. He's charged him with escaping from a sanitarium where he was confined under a court order and has probably brought in police to take him back. Daphne, who had been bravely silent, suddenly started to cry. If they take him back to the sanitarium, it will kill him. We'll try not to let that happen, Mason told her. A police car, with Solon moaning a low but peremptory message for the right-of-way, came around the corner. The police car, traveling at slow speed, started past the lawyer's car, then suddenly stopped. The beam of a red spotlight illuminated the interior of Mason's car. "Well, well, well," Lieutenant Tragg's voice said. "Look who's here." "Why, hello, Lieutenant," Mason said. "What are you doing here?" "I think I'll ask you first and make the question official," Tragg said. "What are you doing here?" "Well, I've been out to see a client on a probate matter," Mason said. "Your client live at the Northern Lights Motel?" Mason grinned and shook his head. "Why?" "We're investigating what seems to be a homicide," Tragg said. "A what?" "Some fellow out here in Unit 21. Evidently somebody fed him some Chinese food that was drugged with a barbiturate, and then, when he went to sleep, turned the gas stove on and didn't light it. Occupants of an adjoining unit smelled the gas, called the proprietor. The proprietor got in the door, opened the windows, shut the gas off. It was too late. You wouldn't know anything about it, would you?" "Heavens, no. I had no idea there had been a death until you just told me now." "Well, I was just checking, that's all," Tragg said. He nodded to the driver of the car. "Let's go." When the police car pulled away, Mason turned back to look at Daphne Shelby. She was sitting white-faced and frozen, her eyes wide with terror. "Well?" Mason asked. She looked at him, tried to say something, then collapsed to the floor of the car. Mason said, "Inskip will be trailing us because we have Daphne in the car with us. Let's see if we can spot him." The lawyer made a U-turn, circled back to the corner, suddenly spotted a car parked at the curb, braked his own car to a stop and motioned. Inskip started the agency car he was driving and pulled alongside. "Tell Paul we're going back to the Serene Slumber Motel," Mason said. "Tell him to come back there as soon as he finds out what's cooking." The lawyer drove back to the motel where Daphne had her room and escorted Daphne inside. "All right," Mason said. "Let's have it straight from the shoulder. Did you have anything to do with your uncle's death?" She shook her head. Her lips quivered. "Loved him," she said. "I've sacrificed most of my life trying to make him comfortable." "That's not the way the evidence is going to point. You smuggled Shelby out of the rest home where he was placed on the orders of a physician, took him to the Northern Lights Motel. You got him to make a will leaving everything to you, and within hours after he made that will, the man was dead. The police have reason to believe that barbiturates entered into it. You brought him a Chinese dinner tonight." "Yes." "And what did you do with the empty containers?" "They weren't quite empty. I had to leave, but Uncle Horace promised he'd flush what was left of the food down the toilet, wash the containers out so they wouldn't smell, and put them in the wastebasket. After all, it isn't a housekeeping unit, it's just a bedroom, and I thought they might make trouble if you used the wastebasket as a garbage pail." "Looking at it from the standpoint of the police, they'll claim you did the flushing, and it will be considered an attempt to conceal the evidence. That and the will you let your uncle make out in your favor can send you to the penitentiary for life." Drake's code knock sounded on the door. Della Street let him in. "Give us the lowdown, Paul." Someone in Unit 22 had been out to dinner, came home and smelled gas coming from Unit 21. The manager got a passkey and opened the door. He opened the door, ran to the windows, opened them, dragged the man's body out in the open. He notified the police. Police arrived and tried resuscitation. It didn't work. "Why did they figure homicide instead of suicide?" Mason asked. "The gas stove is vented," Drake said. "Somebody had unscrewed the feed pipe so the gas could escape directly into the room. The guy had been eating Chinese food. The doctor with the deputy coroner suspected barbiturates. Apparently the food was loaded. I think they also found evidence of drugs in the bathroom." Mason looked at Daphne Shelby. "You stayed with your uncle while you both ate Chinese food?" I left before he was finished." "Did you give him any barbiturates?" "Well, I don't know. I told you he couldn't sleep without these sleeping pills. He's developed such a need for them that he had to have them. I knew that, so when I left him, I gave him the sleeping pills that I had." "Where did you get them?" "They were given to me by the same doctor who treats Uncle Horace. When I went away, I was all run down and nervous. The doctor gave me some sleeping medicine in case I had any trouble sleeping. You put yourself in a beautiful spot for a first-degree murder rap. Heavy steps sounded on the wooden porch of the motel. The knuckles pounded on the door. Lieutenant Tragg, accompanied by a uniformed officer standing on the threshold, had a hard time hiding his surprise. "What the devil are you doing here?" Tragg asked. "Talking with my client." "Well, if your client is the owner of a new Ford out in front, she's going to need an attorney in the worst way." Tragg turned to the uniformed officer and said, "Bring in the woman. Let's see if we can make an identification." Then he pointed out that's hardly the best way to make an identification. "Well, it is in this case. We're working against time." An officer escorted a woman into the motel unit. "Look around," Tragg invited, "and see if there's anyone here you know." The woman instantly pointed to Daphne Shelby. "Why, that's the woman who rented Unit 21, she said. "She told me that her uncle was going to be occupying." Tragg turned to Mason with a grin. "This is your exit line, counselor. Miss Shelby is entitled to have an attorney representing her at all stages of the investigation. Until a short time ago, Daphne Shelby believed in good faith that she was the niece of Horace Shelby. However, whether there is a blood relationship or not, Daphne is very fond of the man she has always regarded as her uncle. When Horace Shelby was sent to the Goodwill Sanitarium by a conservator and a doctor who was employed by other relatives, Daphne obtained employment at the sanitarium. She found Horace Shelby strapped to a bed. She took a knife, cut the straps, took Horace Shelby to the Northern Lights Motel and established him in Unit 21. Now then, Lieutenant, that's as far as we are going to go at this present time. Any objections to letting her identify the body?" "None whatever," Mason said. He turned to Daphne and said, "You come with me." "I'll ride in the car with you," Mason said. Tragg shook his head. "Then Daphne rides with me," Mason announced. Tragg thought things over, then said, "All right, Daphne rides with you. You follow me. I'll tag along behind you just to make the procession complete," Drake added. "Now, you're in for a shock," Mason said to Daphne in a low voice. "They're going to take you to identify your uncle's body. You can make the identification, that's all. I don't want you to volunteer any information or answer any questions. Do you understand?" She nodded in a tight-lipped silence. The cars made a procession down the road until they came to the Northern Lights Motel. A stretcher wagon was waiting to take the remains to the morgue for autopsy. Lieutenant Tragg walked over to the stretcher, took hold of a corner of the blanket, and said, "This way, please, Miss Shelby." She came to stand by the officer. Mason stood at her side, holding her arm. Tragg jerked back the blanket. Suddenly Mason felt Daphne stiffen. She clutched at the lawyer, then gave a half scream. Mason patted her shoulder. "That isn't Uncle Horace. That's Ralph Exeter." Lieutenant Tragg was puzzled. "Who's Ralph Exeter?" Daphne's numb lips made two futile attempts before words came out. "A friend of Uncle Borden." "Then how did Exeter get in this unit of the motel, and where is Horace Shelby now?" Mason said, "Those are two questions, Lieutenant, which you are going to have to answer all by yourself." Tragg turned to Mason. "Since you aren't of any help in this phase of the investigation, you and your client could go, but I want both of you to be available where I can reach you on short notice." The lawyer moved over to Paul Drake, lowered his voice, and said, "Paul, Horace Shelby was in that cabin. He isn't there now. He left under his own power, or he was taken away. If he was taken away, we're in trouble. If he left under his own power, I'd like to make sure that he's on his own and see if we can take some steps to keep him on his own." Drake nodded. Mason put an arm around Daphne Shelby, drew her over to his car, and escorted her into the back seat. "Now then, Exeter checked into this motel sometime this afternoon. That means that they knew where you had placed Uncle Horace and were just biding their time." "Then why didn't they get officers and take him back to the sanitarium?" Daphne asked. Probably because they were afraid that the court-appointed doctor would then examine him, and they wanted to work him over a little bit before they let Dr. Helma get in touch with him. Then you think they have Uncle Horace with them? It's a very distinct possibility, Mason said. We have two alternatives to consider. One is that your Uncle Horace left here with Borden Finchley, but somehow I don't subscribe to that theory. What's the other alternative? That he left here under his own power and of his own volition. But why would he leave here? She asked. Mason looked her straight in the eyes. Because he had killed Ralph Exeter. Why, Uncle Horace wouldn't... Her voice trailed off into silence. You don't know all the details about how your Uncle Horace has been treated. You don't know his mental condition. Suppose Exeter had the adjoining room. Then, after you'd left the motel, Exeter walked into Horace Shelby's room and started making demands on him. Remember that Exeter wasn't really Borden Finchley's friend. He was only interested in getting money. The money had to come from Horace Shelby. Suppose Exeter demanded $125,000 from Horace Shelby as the price of his cooperation. Suppose Exeter said he hadn't had anything to eat and started to help himself to the rest of the food in the containers. Horace wanted to get rid of the man. He simply dumped the rest of the sleeping medicine into the Chinese food. Perhaps his original intention was to drug Exeter into insensibility and then escape. But after he saw Exeter lying there helpless, he may have decided to make a permanent job of it. She shook her head. No, not Uncle Horace. He wouldn't do anything like that. Then, unless we can involve Borden Finchley, there's only one other suspect. Who? You. Me? Mason nodded. But why in the world should I have murdered him? I can think of half a dozen reasons. One of them is that he was the moving force against your Uncle Horace. He was the one who was putting on the pressure. You aren't out of the woods yet, young lady. There are those who think that underneath that shell of cherubic innocence you're a shrewd, scheming individual trying to look out for your own future at all costs. I've been perfectly frank with you, Mr. Mason. Yes, I know. You've told me all the things you wanted me to know. You've put all the cards on the table that you wanted me to see. But I'd feel a lot better about you if you hadn't sneaked out of that hotel, shown such ingenuity in going to that sanitarium and getting a job, and then spiriting your uncle out of there. I stuck my neck out getting some money for you, and I'm entitled to your cooperation. I know. Don't think I don't appreciate all you've done. If the police call on you, I want you to insist that you telephone me. And in the meantime, don't question anything that I do. Why should I question anything that you do? Because I'm going to use your Uncle Horace as a red herring. What do you mean, a red herring? I'm going to let the police get the idea that your Uncle Horace murdered Ralph Exeter, and that he was medically, if not legally, insane at the time he did it. It was well after 10 o'clock that evening when Paul Drake's code knock sounded on the door of Mason's office. What did you find out? Mason asked. I found out how the police knew about the barbiturates. In the bathroom of Unit 21, they found a tumbler with a glass tube of a toothpaste case and a little white powder. Someone had used the glass tube to grind up the sleeping pills. It's a barbiturate called somniferon. Somniferon was prescribed for Horace Shelby by the doctor who was called in by Borden Finchley after they moved in. He's the same doctor who prescribed the sedative for Daphne to take with her on her long ocean voyage. Just before she left, they filled the prescription for her. She had a whole 3-month supply of somniferon. We found a cab driver who received a call to pick up a passenger at the Northern Lights Motel. He went there. An elderly man who seemed somewhat confused was waiting. He got in the cab and seemed a little uncertain about where he wanted to go. He started for Union Station, then changed his mind and said he'd go to the airport. The cab took him to the airport. The man seemed to be loaded with cash. A $100 bill was the smallest he had. This was a good hour before Daphne went to the Chinese restaurant, got the food, and went to the Northern Lights Motel. All right, Mason said. That's circumstantial evidence, but we haven't got all the evidence yet, Paul. Daphne didn't have any motive for killing Ralph Exeter. What about Borden Finchley? Where was he while all this was going on? Borden Finchley has an alibi, So does his wife, Eleanor. You've checked? I've checked. The Finchleys were moving all of Daphne's things out of her room. The housekeeper was downstairs most of the time, crying over what was happening. Mason said, There were men from Las Vegas who were interested, Paul. When I made my first visit to the sanitarium, a man came up to the car and asked me if I was the doctor the court had appointed to examine Horace Shelby. I told him I wasn't. The man hurriedly walked away, got in a car which was parked some distance ahead, and drove off. I couldn't make out the license number, but I could see it was a Nevada license plate. Could be, all right, Drake said. But at the time your client was in Unit 21 at the Northern Lights Motel, apparently taking food to Horace Shelby. Horace Shelby had been long gone. Mason nodded to Della Street. Get her on the phone, he said. The three of them sat waiting in tense expectancy. After a while, Della Street said, You certain you're ringing the right room, operator? Oh, thank you. We'll call later. Perry Mason got up from his chair, nodded to Drake. Okay, folks, let's go. We'll take a taxi cab. I don't want a parking problem when we get there. We can get plenty of cabs in front of the hotel when we want to come back. Mason gave the driver the name of Daphne's hotel, and the driver made a quick run, getting there within a matter of 7 or 8 minutes. There was a sign on the door of the room, Do Not Disturb. Mason's knuckles banged on the door. There was no answer. Mason said, Della, I hate to ask you to do this, but I want to see the inside of that room. Go down on the elevator, leave the hotel, then re-enter, walking boldly up to the clerk's desk, and ask him for the key to 718. If you have just the right amount of assurance, just the right poise, he'll hand the key to you. If he asks you your name, tell him Daphne Shelby. If he goes any further and asks for identification, tell him who you are. Tell him I'm waiting up here, that Daphne is my client, that I'm afraid she's been drugged or perhaps murdered and is not answering the door because she can't answer the door. Chief, do you really think he's... How do I know? Mason said. We've had one murder. We could have 2. What I'm telling you now is an attitude you're to adopt with the house detective if necessary. Tell him I'm waiting up here with a private detective. That would take you off the spot for trying to get the key to another person's room. You think you can do it? I can make one of the best attempts you ever saw, she said, smiling. Della Street walked to the elevator, rang the button, and a moment later was taken down. They waited for some 4 or 5 minutes, and then the elevator stopped again at the 7th floor. The doors slid back, and Della Street nodded her thanks to the operator and started walking rapidly toward them. She exhibited the key with the metallic oval tag fastened to it by a ring. She fitted the key to the door. Better let me do this, Mason said, stepping forward. If the door is bolted from the inside, it means we've got a major problem. It isn't bolted. I'm her attorney, and I better be the one that opens the door. The key clicked back in the latch. Mason tentatively tried the door, turned the knob, pushed against the door, then put his shoulder against it. That does it. Bolted from the inside. We got to get the house detective and force the door. The bolt on the inside of the door slid all the way back, and the door opened. Daphne Shelby, in a sheer nightgown, stood sleepily regarding them. What? I'm dizzy. Oh, help! She collapsed to the floor. Della Street ran to her side. Mason said, There's a house physician here. Let's get him. But first, keep her from going to sleep. Paul, get some cold towels. Keep her moving. Daphne took 1 or 2 steps, and then suddenly slumped, moaned, and said, Oh, I'm so sleepy, so sleepy. Mason said, What happened, Daphne? I think I'm poisoned, she said sleepily. I stopped at the lunch counter. I had some hot chocolate and some toast. Chocolate tasted funny. Abruptly, Daphne ceased talking and became a dead weight. Mason said, Get on the phone, Paul. Get the house doctor up here. Tell him we have a sleeping pill case. Mason shoved a cold towel down Daphne's spine. Oh, she exclaimed, giving a little jump. That's cold. It'll do you good. Keep walking. Paul, fill the bathtub full of water that's just a little bit warmer than lukewarm. Della Street can see that she gets a tepid bath. just enough to give her a little stimulation to keep her from getting chilled. Again, her legs seemed to buckle. Mason and Della lifted the dead weight. Mason pulled back his left hand and with the palm gave Daphne's rump a sharp slap. Her back arched as she jerked her hips out of the way. "Don't you ever do that again," she blazed, and then suddenly moaned and again collapsed. This time neither the lawyer nor Della Street could get her to make any effort to stand on her feet. There was a knock on the door. Drake opened it. A professional-appearing man with a black medical bag said, "I'm Dr. Selkirk." Mason said, "This young woman seems to have been given an overdose of barbiturates." "All right," Dr. Selkirk said. "We'll pump her stomach out." The physician pumped out the contents of the stomach, then listened with a stethoscope at the girl's chest. He frowned, took her pulse, then went over to the pitcher containing the contents of the stomach. Mason stepped into the bathroom, said to Paul Drake, "Get that water just as ice cold as you can get it, Paul." "What?" Drake asked incredulously. "Just as cold as you can get it." Dr. Selkirk motioned to Perry Mason. "May I see you a minute?" Dr. Selkirk lowered his voice. "There's something funny about this. Her pulse is strong and active. Her respiration is normal and regular, but there are remains in the stomach contents that are pills, all right." "You mean the pills haven't digested? Did she swallow them in the chocolate?" "She's had chocolate, but I doubt if the pills were ingested at the same time as the chocolate. I think they were taken later." "Come on, Della," Mason said. "Get her in the bathroom. Let her soak in that water for about 10 minutes. Leave her clothes on, just dunk her in the water." Della said, "You'll have to help me." They picked Daphne up, carried her to the door of the bathroom, swung her around over the bathwater. The girl splashed into the bathtub. There was a shrill scream. Daphne exclaimed, "What the hell do you think you're doing?" and came up out of the bathtub, pushing, clawing, fighting mad. "That water's ice cold, you son of a—" "All right, Daphne," Mason interrupted. "It was a good try, but it didn't work. Della will help you dry out and bring you some clothes, and perhaps you can come out here and tell us what this is really all about." Mason stepped out and closed the door. Drake said, "How the hell did you know, Perry?" "The first 2 steps she took when she started walking were perfectly normal steps. Then she suddenly remembered and took all the spring out of her legs." He broke off as knuckles sounded on the door. Lieutenant Tragg's voice called out, "Open up! This is the law!" Dr. Selkirk walked over and opened the door. Tragg showed surprise. "Is a Miss Daphne Shelby in here?" he asked, and then suddenly catching sight of Perry Mason said, "Well, for heaven's sake, what are you doing here?" Mason stepped to the door of the bathroom, said, "Lieutenant Tragg is here. He's going to ask you some questions, Daphne, and I don't want you to answer a single question, not a word." "Now, wait a minute," Tragg said. "Tactics such as these are going to be responsible for making a lot of trouble for this young lady." After a few minutes, Della Street and Daphne emerged from the bathroom. "I'm sorry, Daphne," Lieutenant Tragg said, "but you're going to have to go down to headquarters. I'm going to keep you there tonight where I can be sure I can put my finger on you in the morning." Daphne, her head erect, her eyes flashing, marched toward the door, turned to Perry Mason and said, "Mr. Smarty Pants, you with your cold water." Mason warned, "Be your age, Daphne. I'm trying to help you. Your own efforts are amateurish." "Well, yours are thoroughly professional and disgusting," she snapped. Lieutenant Tragg listened curiously. "All right, come on, let's go." They left the room. Perry Mason said in a low voice, "Keep your key, Della." They all rode down in the elevator. Tragg hustled Daphne across the lobby and into a police car. Mason said hurriedly, "Let's go back up to Daphne's room." "Why?" Drake asked. "Why do you think Daphne took those sleeping pills? She wanted to keep us from speculating on what she'd been doing while we were knocking on the door and waiting." "What had she been doing?" Della Street asked. "Unless I missed my guess very much indeed," Mason said. "She had been visiting with her Uncle Horace Shelby in the adjoining room." "That's a wild hunch," Della Street said. Mason grinned. Perhaps it is, but we're going back to Daphne's room, knock on the connecting door leading to the next room, and see what happens. Now, while I'm knocking on that door, Paul, you're going to be standing in the corridor, so in case Uncle Horace tries to slip out, you'll be in a position to nab him. Come on, let's go. Mason went at once to the door at the side of Daphne Shelby's room, a door which apparently communicated with the adjoining room. The door silently opened. The room was empty. Mason hurriedly looked at the bathroom and the closet, then ran to the hallway door and jerked it open. Paul Drake was standing in the corridor. No one came out, Drake said. Quick, Mason said. He's smart. He checked out while we were in there with Daphne. She put on an act, not only to protect herself, but also to give him time for a getaway. In the lobby, Mason hurried to the cashier's desk. You had a check out in 7:20? He asked. Why, yes, just a few minutes ago. What did the man look like? Rather elderly, slender, distinguished-looking, but nervous. Well, there he goes now. Where? Just through the revolving door to the street. Mason raced across the lobby, out of the door, said to the doorman, Get us a cab, quick. Mason, Della Street, and Paul Drake jumped in the cab. Where to? Cabby asked. Follow that man who's walking down the street, Mason said, and don't let him know you're following. Don't we want to stop him? Drake asked. Hell no, Mason said. Let's see where he's going. The man went to the hotel garage. He'll come out driving a car, Mason said to the cab driver, and we've got to follow him. Paul, there's a telephone booth there. Get your office on the line. How many cars do you have with telephones? 2. Get them both in action, Mason said. Start one east, one south. It was a matter of nearly 10 minutes before the man they were following emerged, driving a car with Massachusetts license plates. Mason took one gleeful look at the license plates, then grabbed Drake by the arm. That's Ralph Exeter's car. Mason turned to the cab driver. You're going to have to follow him. It'll be difficult once he gets out of town, but do the best you can. The elderly man drove the car cautiously, keeping well under the speed limits. The car turned onto the Santa Ana freeway, began to gather speed. After 10 minutes, the car stopped at a service station for gasoline. Pull in, Mason said. Isn't that dangerous? Della Street asked. He doesn't know what we look like, Mason said. The driver of the car with Massachusetts license plates went to the restroom. Paul Drake was at the telephone. Get the number of your cruising car that's headed south, Mason said. He's probably on the freeway here somewhere. Tell him where we are. Tell him to try and pick us up. At length, the driver emerged from the restroom, and Mason had a good look at the man's face. It was an aristocratic face. High, thin nose, a stubbly gray mustache, high cheekbones, blue eyes. Drake emerged from the phone booth and nodded. The man is about 5 miles behind us. These taxicabs are so darn conspicuous, Perry. Shelby will get wise if we follow him. That's why we're going out first, Mason said. He's committed himself to the freeway now. There's not much chance he'd turn off. Mason paid the gas bill, said to the cab driver, Straight on down the freeway and go slow. Let the other car pass us, if it will. Hold everything, Drake exclaimed. Here's my agency car. A big, sleek, black sedan drove alongside. Driver tapped the horn a couple of times. Pull off to the side and stop, Mason said to the cab driver. Here's $20. That'll cover your fare out here and back. The cab came to a stop. The passengers jumped into the big sedan. A few moments later, Drake, who had been looking out of the back window, said, Here comes our man, Perry. The Massachusetts car drove on past. The agency car fell in behind. I don't get this, Drake said. What's Horace Shelby doing driving Ralph Exeter's car? And why did Daphne have him put in the adjoining room and hold the questions? We're getting the answers. Della Street said, This is no life for a working girl. We're apt to be in Tucson by the time I have to open the office in the morning. More likely Ensenada, Mason said. They settled back for a long job of following. But to their surprise, the car had stopped in a motel in San Diego, and the driver rented a room under the name of H.R. Dawson. Mason himself gave instructions to the operative. We'll get you relief just as soon as possible. Keep in touch by phone. You're going to have to stick it out to put the finger on the subject. but we should have somebody to help you within the hour. Now we got to get a car and get back." The driver used his phone to summon a taxicab. Mason had the cab take him into the car rental agency, and within half an hour the attorney, Della Street, and Paul Drake were headed back north in the rented car. "Don't we have to report what we've been doing?" Drake asked. "Why?" "Well, if that's Horace Shelby, he's a suspect in a murder case." "Suspect by whom?" Mason asked. "The police, but not by me," Mason said. "We got to give Horace Shelby a break." "What kind of a break?" "We're going to let him be his own man for a while. We're also going to give him a chance to outwit the police just as much as possible. If his half-brother shows that he's an incompetent again, we can show that he was outwitting Lieutenant Tragg, and that calls for a rather high IQ. "I thought you were going to try and make him a murderer and prove that he was legally insane," Della Street said. Mason grinned. Now, the good campaigner changes his battle plans in accordance with changing facts. Now, Paul, get an operative to check into the Northern Lights Motel. The place would be filled up. The only vacancy would be Unit 21. The police have removed the body, and by this time have released it for rental. Now then, have another man use his official ID card and go to the motel early in the morning. Have him ask to see the registration cards, and have him get the numbers of all cars with Nevada license plates. Run down these registrations, if there are any, and run a preliminary check on the owners, who they are, what they do." A rather exhausted Della Street entered the office at 10 o'clock the next morning to find Perry Mason already on the job. "Things are moving," Mason said. "Paul Drake's man from San Diego telephoned. Horace Shelby has crossed the border, gone through Tijuana, and is on his way to Ensenada. Apparently he doesn't have the faintest idea that anyone is following him. But he's no longer in the Massachusetts car." "He isn't?" "No, he parked that one in San Diego, purchased a used car for cash at one of the car lots." "What about Daphne?" "They don't have a thing in the world against her. But the district attorney's office has had a complete report from the police, has read a lot of unwarranted meaning into the evidence, and wants to try her. They think they've got a case. I've demanded a preliminary hearing." "Do they have enough evidence to bind her over?" "They think so. They are absolutely convinced that Ralph Exeter was in that motel unit after Horace Shelby had left, that Daphne bought the Chinese food for him, and that Daphne and Exeter are the two who ate food, in which case she gave him the barbiturates," Della Street asked. Mason nodded. "We've had some dealings with Bill Hadley, the physicist detective. He knows metallurgy. I have an idea that he might take a look at that disconnected gas pipe in Unit 21 and come up with some answers the police don't have as yet. You don't disconnect a gas pipe with your fingers. It takes tools, and regardless of what the police may think at the present time, no jury is going to feel that a girl like Daphne would have been carrying a bunch of tools with her to disconnect gas pipes. Now I'm going to see Daphne and see what kind of a night she had." Mason left the office, went to the detention ward, and muttered expressions of sympathy as a bedraggled Daphne Shelby, who had quite evidently passed a sleepless night, was brought into the consulting room by the matron. "Pretty rough, Daphne?" Mason asked. She started to cry, but then caught herself, threw her head back defiantly, and said, "It's rough, but I can take it." Mason said, "Somehow it seems impossible to impress upon you that you should play fair with your lawyer. What have I done now?" "It's what you haven't done. You forgot to tell me about your Uncle Horace having been registered in the hotel in that room right next to yours, and the fact that you had been in there talking with him when I first knocked on the door of your room." "Mr. Mason, let's have one understanding. I'm going to be fair and play fair with you except for one thing. I am not going to tell anything that might hurt Uncle Horace. Did you know that he was driving Ralph Exeter's car?" She looked at him defiantly in the eyes, took a long breath, and said, "No." "All right, we're playing games, Daphne. You're playing games with me to protect your uncle. Now I'm going to tell you something. I'm representing you. I'm going to try and get you acquitted on this murder charge. I'm not representing your uncle. I'm going to try every legal and ethical strategy that I know of to get you acquitted. That's my duty. Do you understand that?" "Yes, I guess so." "You're going to have to stay here for a while. Mason said. He got up to go. Suddenly her hand was on his arm. Please, Mr. Mason, I can take it. I'm young. I'm resilient. But if Uncle Horace got in one of these places, he'd go absolutely crazy. Daphne, I'm protecting you. A lawyer doesn't have room for more than one allegiance. You have to get accustomed to that. And, she said, I'm protecting Uncle Horace. You'll have to get accustomed to that. Mason grinned. I've learned to accustom myself to that the hard way. Mason returned to his office to find that Paul Drake had a significant report. A Nevada car had been registered at the Northern Lights Motel. The owner had registered as Harvey Miles of Carson City, but the car registered in the name of Stanley Freer of Las Vegas. Get a rundown? Mason asked. On Freer, yes. Freer is a collector. They use him when some tin horn tries to squirm out of paying a gambling debt. Now, if Exeter owed a gambling debt, Freer called on him and perhaps told him Horace Shelby was hiding in Unit 21 at the Northern Lights. It's a cinch Exeter would have gone there to try a shakedown. That figures, Paul. Some men from Nevada were watching the sanitarium. They were anxious to talk with the doctor the court appointed. That means the gamblers were getting tired of waiting. It also means they were very much on the job. They could have discovered when Horace Shelby left the place and where he went. Then they told Exeter they weren't going to wait for Shelby to die, that it was up to Exeter to get the money or else. Then a collector would have tagged along to see what Exeter was doing, and if Exeter bungled the job, that collector might have lowered the boom on him. Yeah, it's a possibility, Drake agreed. Those collectors are willing to write off a debt every once in a while in order to throw a scare into the pigeons. If word gets around a man who gets too delinquent and payments doesn't stay healthy, it helps with collections everywhere. The jury might buy that theory, Paul. I might even buy it myself. Marvin Mosher, one of the leading trial deputies of the district attorney's office, addressed Judge Lyndon Kyle. The defendant, Daphne Shelby, thought until a few days ago that she was the niece of Horace Shelby. She had acted as this man's niece and, as the evidence will show, had ingratiated herself with him and was on the point of using that relationship to secure a very material financial advantage. It was at this point Shelby's half-brother, Borden Finchley, and his wife, Eleanor, accompanied by a friend, came to call on Horace Shelby. They were shocked at what they found, the extent to which Horace Shelby had become dependent on her. Finchley suggested that the defendant take a 3-month vacation, that they would take care of Horace Shelby while she was gone. While she was gone, the Finchleys learned not only that Horace Shelby intended to make her the sole beneficiary under his will, but that he had been giving the defendant large sums of money and was preparing to give her even larger sums of money. Was this woman his niece? She was not, Your Honor. She was the daughter of Horace Shelby's former housekeeper, a daughter by an affair which had taken place at the other end of the continent. The defendant, in good faith, thought Horace Shelby was her uncle. He had led her so to believe. The Finchleys found that Horace Shelby had deteriorated mentally, that he had exaggerated ideas as to what he considered his duty toward the defendant, that the defendant was carrying on a course which could well strip this rather elderly man of every cent he had in the world. The Finchleys went to court and asked that a conservator be appointed. When Daphne returned from the Orient and found that the fortune that she expected to inherit was being placed beyond her grasp, she became furious. Horace Shelby, at that time, had been placed in a sanitarium for treatment. Daphne Shelby secured employment in that institution, using an assumed name and taking a job for just long enough to surreptitiously aid Horace Shelby in making an escape. She took him to a motel known as the Northern Lights Motel. From that day on, none of the real relatives of Horace Shelby have seen him or heard from him. Horace Shelby, with the connivance of this defendant, vanished into thin air after making a will, leaving everything to this defendant. He may well be dead. Moreover, By the use of an ingenious fraud perpetrated upon the court, and despite the appointment of a conservator, the defendant managed to get her hands on $50,000 of Horace Shelby's funds. The decedent, Ralph Exeter, was a friend of the Finchleys, and as such, familiar with the facts. It appears in some way Exeter traced Horace Shelby to the Northern Lights Motel. The evidence will indicate that the defendant lured Exeter into the room occupied by Horace Shelby at a time shortly after Horace Shelby had left the place. She placed a barbiturate in food which was given to Exeter, and after Exeter became unconscious, left him in the motel after first deliberately unscrewing the gas feed pipe which went to a vented heating appliance in the unit. We wish to call the court's attention to a matter which is, of course, elemental. At this time, we only need to show that a crime has been committed and to show reasonable grounds for believing that the defendant perpetrated the crime. In that event, the court is duty-bound to hold the defendant for trial in the higher court. Mosher sat down. Judge Kyle said, "If the proof bears out this statement, there is certainly no doubt that the court should bind the defendant over for trial." "May I make an opening statement?" Mason asked. "Why, yes, if you desire," Judge Kyle said, "although this is entirely unusual." Mason said, "The evidence will show that the Finchleys had for years taken no interest in Horace Shelby. When they learned, however, that Shelby had become comparatively wealthy, they came to visit him, and on finding that Shelby had made a will, or intended to make a will, leaving his property to the defendant, they hustled the defendant off to the Orient, and in 3 months that they had Horace Shelby under their control, exasperated him to such a point that the man was desperate. Learning of the intentions to railroad him into a sanitarium, Shelby tried to get a substantial part of his fortune out from the control of the Finchleys, so that he would have some money with which to fight the case as he saw fit. He therefore asked the defendant to take charge of that money. She tried to do so, but was prevented by an order of the court appointing a conservator. As to the $50,000 which the prosecutor would have the court believe the defendant had secured by artifice and fraud, the money was secured legally and through my efforts. It was given to the defendant, and she, in turn, gave the bulk of that money to Horace Shelby, so that he would be able to spend his own funds. We expect to show that Ralph Exeter was a professional gambler, indebted to other gamblers, that the Finchleys were, in turn, indebted to him, and that Exeter was the driving force behind this situation, suggesting to the Finchleys that they use their connection and relationship to Horace Shelby to raise immediate money. We expect to show that Ralph Exeter found where Horace Shelby was located, that Exeter made demands upon him, offering to let Shelby keep his liberty in return for a substantial cash payment. We expect to show that Shelby mashed up some sleeping pills which had been given him by the defendant, put them in food which was given Exeter for the sole purpose of enabling Shelby to escape from the clutches of his over-solicitous relatives. It is our contention that after the defendant had left the motel, after the departure of Horace Shelby, while Ralph Exeter was asleep in the room, someone disconnected the gas pipe and asphyxiated Exeter. "You can prove this?" Judge Kyle asked. "We can prove it," Mason said. Judge Kyle was thoughtful for a few moments, then said to Mosher, "Very well, put on your proof." Mosher called witness after witness. The waitress at the Chinese restaurant, Dr. Tillman Baxter of the sanitarium, Lieutenant Tragg, building an ironclad case of circumstantial evidence. Lieutenant Tragg told of finding Ralph Exeter dead in the motel unit at the Northern Lights. He had found in the room a glass tumbler. In the glass tumbler was the glass container in which new toothbrushes were sold. This had been used as a pestle in grinding up pills which were identified as somaferon. Mason arose and smiled affably at the police officer to cross-examine him. "You say the pipe which connected the gas heater to the gas supply had been unscrewed, Lieutenant?" "Yes." "And you gave it as your conclusion that this had been done after the decedent had become unconscious from the barbiturates?" "As an investigating officer, I felt that was a reasonable interpretation," Lieutenant Tragg said. The autopsy bears this out. I took into consideration that the unscrewing of such a pipe would be accompanied by considerable noise, and Exeter could hardly have been expected to sit idly by while the preparations for his death were being carried out. Unless, of course, he had committed suicide, Mason said. If he committed suicide, Mr. Mason, he disposed of the weapon, and when we find the missing weapon, we usually discount the theory of suicide. Weapon? Mason asked. A small pipe wrench, Lieutenant Tragg said. The gas pipe had been joined to the heater so that there would be no leak, and it took a pipe wrench to loosen the 3-inch section of the connecting pipe. There was no wrench in the room. Ah, yes, Mason said affably. I was coming to that. You've anticipated the point I was going to make. It took a pipe wrench to loosen the gas feed line? Yes, indeed. In order to prevent leaks, these lines are customarily screwed up very tight? Yes, sir. Sometimes with a compound which furnishes a seal and prevents leakage? That's right. And in order to loosen this pipeline, it took considerable force, did it not? Tragg avoided the trap. Quite a bit of force, he admitted, but nothing that a reasonably strong young woman in good health couldn't have done, if that's what you're getting at. That's not what I'm getting at, Lieutenant, Mason said. The point is that a pipe wrench has to bite into the pipe in order to get a firm enough hold in order to unscrew the pipe. Now, these pipe wrenches have jaws with sharp ridges on them, so that when pressure is applied to the handle, the jaws tighten. The corrugations on the jaw bite into the pipe enough to keep the pipe from slipping. Is that right? Yes, sir. And it is because you found indentations in this pipe that you knew it had been loosened with a pipe wrench? Yes, sir. Now then, did you photograph these marks on the pipe? No, sir. Why should I have photographed them? Did you then disconnect the pipe so that it could be used as evidence? Certainly not. Gas was escaping. We reconnected the pipe just as promptly as possible. Did you realize, Lieutenant, that on some of these pipe wrenches, one of the ridges on the jaws becomes damaged or nicked, so that the wrench leaves an indelible identifying mark on any pipe on which it may be used? We didn't remove the pipe. It's still there in its original condition. And as of this date, Lieutenant, you don't know whether there were any distinctive markings in the indentations on that pipe, which would give an indication of the wrench that had been used in unscrewing it. Lieutenant Tragg shifted his position and finally said, I will admit, Mr. Mason, you have a point there. I don't know. I will also admit that perhaps the better practice would have been to have examined those markings carefully under a microscope. Thank you very much for a very impartial statement, Lieutenant Tragg. I have no further questions. Very well, Judge Kyle said. It's the hour of the evening adjournment, and the court will adjourn until tomorrow morning at 9:30 o'clock. The defendant is remanded, court's adjourned. Back in his office, Mason found Paul Drake with a supplemental report on Horace Shelby. The guy's doing pretty good, Drake said. He's down there in Ensenada soaking up sunlight. Anyone talk with him yet? Not as an interview, but one of my men managed to engage him in conversation when Shelby was taking a stroll down on the wharf, and he reports the man is bright as a dollar. You going down? I'm going down. I'll have Pinky fly me by fast twin-motored plane to San Diego, then pick up Francisco Munoz at Tijuana and instruct your man to be looking for me. I'll meet him in front of the motel. Put shadows on Borden Finchley and his wife. Watch them carefully. Now then, Paul, do you know anything about the technique of taking a pipe wrench, putting a piece of chamois skin around the jaws so that you can get a tight enough grip on a bit of metal so you can unscrew it, so the jaws don't leave any mark in the metal? I've seen it done, Drake said. Mason handed Drake a section of pipe. Have your man at the Northern Lights get the section of pipe which connects the gas feed to that heating stove out of there and replace it with this pipe. Drake turned the piece of pipe over slowly in his hands. This has deep marks on it, he said. The marks of a pipe wrench, and there's a nick in the jaws. Exactly, Mason said. Carefully remove the piece of pipe that's now in there, and be careful you don't leave any marks on it. Take that piece of pipe into custody and hold it until Tragg asks you for it. Now get busy and get this thing done fast before somebody raises a question about it." Drake sighed. "You can skate faster and on thinner ice than anybody I ever worked with." The taxi came to a stop at Casa de Mañana Motel. Mason assisted Della Street from the cab, paid off the driver. Inskip, Paul's detective, gave a low whistle from a parked car, and Mason and Della Street crossed over to the car. "Unit 5, Inskip said. "He's in there." Mason said, "Wait here, Inskip. You'll be taking us to the airport, and then your job will be over." Mason knocked on the door of number 5. There was no answer. He knocked again. The door opened, a tentative crack. Mason surveyed the anxious face, smiled reassuringly, and said, "I'm Perry Mason, Mr. Shelby, and this is my secretary, Della Street. We thought it was time to have a talk with you." "You're Perry Mason? How did you—" "Oh, well, never mind. Come on in." Shelby opened the door. "It's been a long, hard battle for you," Mason said. "You're the attorney representing Daphne?" "Yes. She's having troubles." "She's having troubles?" "She's being tried for the murder of Ralph Exeter," Mason said. Shelby's face showed a succession of expression: surprise, consternation, anger. "You said murder?" "I said murder." "Ralph Exeter," Shelby said, spitting out the words. "That cheap, blackmailing, gambling four-flusher. So he's dead. Who killed him?" "The police say Daphne did. In Unit 21 at the Northern Lights Motel." Shelby was silent for a long, thoughtful period. Della Street surreptitiously extracted her shorthand notebook from her purse and started taking notes. Shelby said at length, "Well, I guess I better face the music." "The music?" Mason asked. "If he was found dead in the room I occupied at the Northern Lights Motel, I killed him." "How?" Mason asked. "I gave him an overdose of sleeping pills. I've been through hell, Mr. Mason, absolute hell. I'm not a young man anymore. I know that my mind wanders at times. I don't coordinate the way I should, but I'm able to take care of myself. I know how I want to handle my business. You have no idea what it means to suddenly have the rug jerked out from underneath you, to have others telling you what to do, to have people giving you hypodermics, strapping you in bed. I wouldn't go through that again if I had to commit a dozen murders." Mason nodded sympathetically. "Daphne got me out of it, bless her soul. She got me down at that room at the Northern Lights." "And then what?" "She told me to stay undercover, that she'd come and bring me food." "And she did?" "Yes. She went to a Chinese restaurant and brought in some Chinese food. After she left, she hadn't been gone over 2 minutes. There was a knock at the door. I sat tight for a while, but the knock was repeated and I didn't want to attract attention to the unit by not answering the door. So I opened it, and there was Ralph Exeter. He pushed his way into the room and went right up to me. He said that he was the one who controlled my future. That if I wanted to pay him $150,000, I could go on my way. That he'd see that Borden Finchley and his wife cleared out. That I could have what was left of my own money to do what I wanted with. That if I didn't play ball with him, he was going to swear that I was completely incompetent and that I'd spend the rest of my days in a sanitarium under the influence of dope or strapped to a cot. Go on." Daphne had given me some sleeping pills to take in case I needed them. I stepped into the bathroom, ground up some of those sleeping pills in a glass, and came back into the room. I was going to try and slip them into a drink or something, but the guy played right into my hands. When I came back, he was looking around at that Chinese food. I told him we'd had some chopsticks. I got them, and as I handed them to him, took the opportunity to dump the ground-up sleeping pills into the food. It wasn't long before he stretched out on the bed, yawned, and went to sleep. I took his car, went to the Hollander Heath Hotel, and managed to get the room next to Daphne's. Why did you take his car? Well, I had to. I tried calling a taxicab earlier in the day. I had to go out and stand on the street corner to wait for it. That was dangerous. What did you do with the taxicab? I went to the airport and tried to rent a car, and neither of the places there would let me have one unless I had my driver's license. I took a bus back to El Mirar. What happened after you got to the Hollander Heath Hotel? Daphne was in the room with me. She didn't hear people pounding on the door. She'd made the mistake of bolting the door from the inside, and that way people knew she was in there. She had to do something quick. She gulped the rest of my sleeping pills, put on a nightie, and opened the door. She was going to put on an act until the sleeping pills began to take effect. She said they'd pump her stomach out. This would mix things up enough so I'd have a chance to escape. Is it true, Mason asked, that Daphne is the daughter of your housekeeper? Shelby looked him square in the eyes. It's true, he said, and it's also true that I'm her father. What? Mason exclaimed. That's the truth. I wanted to marry Daphne's mother, but she hadn't been divorced, and she couldn't get a divorce. Then my other brother and his wife got killed in an auto accident, and I felt we could bring Daphne up as my niece. But, of course, Borden Finchley would know that that wasn't the truth, so I told Borden that Daphne was the daughter of my housekeeper, and that the housekeeper had been pregnant when she came from the East to work for me. Borden Finchley never cared anything about me. He was indebted to Ralph Exeter on a big gambling debt. Exeter was putting the screws on him. If I gave Ralph Exeter too much drug and he died, well, that's a responsibility I've got to take. But all I was trying to do was to get him to go to sleep so that I could get out of there, and that's the truth. Mason said, the sleeping pills didn't kill him. Somebody unscrewed the gas pipe, and he was asphyxiated by gas. What? Shelby exclaimed. Mason nodded. Shelby paused for a moment, then sighed. Well, I guess I've got to take the rap. No one's ever going to believe it the other way. Mason looked at his watch. I have planes waiting, he said. Horace Shelby sighed, took a new suitcase from under the bed, started packing clothes. It'll take me 10 minutes to be ready. Court reconvened at 9:30. If the court please, Marvin Mosher said. I wish to recall Lieutenant Tragg for further direct examination. Lieutenant Tragg returned to the stand. Mosher said, There was some question yesterday about the evidence of tool marks on the pipe in the motel. You stated that you had not taken that pipe as evidence. I will ask you, Lieutenant, if there has been any change in the situation since yesterday. Yes, sir. What is the present situation? I went to that unit in the motel this morning and removed the section of the connecting pipe. I have it here. Lieutenant Tragg handed the deputy prosecutor a section of pipe. We object, Mason said, on the grounds that no proper foundation has been laid. The police can't prove that this is now the same pipe that was in the unit at the time they discovered the body. Judge Kyle turned to Lieutenant Tragg. Was there any evidence that the pipe had been tampered with from the time you first saw it until you secured this section of pipe? None whatever. Were the tool marks which appear on this pipe the same as the ones which were on the pipe when you first saw it? They seem to be entirely similar. Very well, I'll admit the pipe in evidence. Cross-examine, Mosher snapped to Mason. Have you, Mason asked Lieutenant Tragg, examined these tool marks through a magnifying glass? No, sir, no, I haven't. I just secured the evidence before coming to court. Mason produced a magnifying glass from his pocket, studied the tool marks on the pipe, handed the glass and the pipe back to Lieutenant Tragg. I invite you to study the tool marks now, he said. Tragg adjusted the magnifying glass. Suddenly he seemed to stiffen. See anything? Mason asked. I believe, Lieutenant Tragg said cautiously, that there is evidence here that one of the tool marks is distinctive. One of the sharp edges of the jaws of the pipe wrench seems to have a flaw in it, a break. So that the tool with which this pipe was disconnected can be identified. Possibly so, Lieutenant Tragg said. Then you admit that you overlooked a material piece of evidence. Tragg fidgeted uneasily, said, Well, the evidence is now before the court. That's all, Mason said. That concludes our case, Mosher said. Is there any defense? Judge Kyle asked. There will be a defense, Mason said, and I call as my first witness Horace Shelby. What? Mosher exclaimed. My first witness will be Horace Shelby. If the court please, this comes as a very great surprise to the prosecution, Mosher said. May I ask for a 15-minute recess? I would like to report to the district attorney personally. I will give you 15 minutes, Judge Kyle said. When the judge had left the bench, Mason turned to Daphne. Daphne, you're going to have to prepare yourself for a shock. I want it to be a surprise to you. They're going to be watching your reactions. I want them to see your surprise. You actually have Uncle Horace where you can call him as a witness? Mason nodded. I've had 3 expert psychiatrists examine your uncle. One of them late last night, 2 of them this morning. He's been pronounced absolutely sane. You sit here, Daphne, and don't talk with anybody. I'll be back in a moment. Mason sauntered over to the place where Paul Drake was waiting. Got your men shadowing all the subjects, Paul? Drake nodded. Mason stretched, yawned. You look as if you were holding 4 aces, Drake said. Actually, all I have is a pair of deuces. I'm shoving a stack of blues into the middle of the table. Suddenly, Hamilton Burger, the district attorney, came striding into the courtroom. Judge Kyle returned from chambers, took the bench, called court to order, and said, I see the district attorney himself is here in court. You are interested in this case, Mr. Burger? Very much so, Your Honor. May I ask why? Because, Hamilton Burger said, in the event that the defendant did not murder Ralph Exeter, Horace Shelby did. And I want to see that every bit of legal procedure is handled in such a manner that we can't be jockeyed into a position of not being able to prosecute Horace Shelby. Very well, Judge Kyle said. Proceed, Mr. Mason. Call Horace Shelby to the stand, Mason said. Shelby took the oath and his position on the witness stand. I object to this witness giving testimony on the grounds that he is incompetent to testify, that he is suffering from a disease known as senile dementia, Hamilton Burger said. Judge Kyle turned to the witness. Court wants to ask you a few questions, Mr. Shelby. You understand that this is a courtroom? Yes, sir. You have been declared an incompetent by the court in this county? I don't know as to that. I was beset by greedy relatives who gave me drugs that I knew nothing about, who railroaded me into a so-called sanitarium where I was restrained against my will. I understand the court that committed me has designated a doctor to examine me. Mason was on his feet. If the court please, he said, Dr. Grantland Alma, who was appointed by the court to examine this man, has examined him and pronounced him absolutely competent, completely sane. 2 other well-known psychiatrists have also examined him and pronounced him sane, as well as completely competent to conduct his own affairs. Now, I can call these doctors if the court wishes. Hamilton Burger held a whispered conference with Marvin Mosher, then said, I understand, if the court please, that there are 2 doctors who will testify that he is suffering from senile dementia. 2 general practitioners who could never qualify as specialists, Mason said. If you wish to take up the court's time having 2 general practitioners testify against 3 specialists, well, we can do so. Hamilton Berger had another whispered conference and said, "We will temporarily withdraw our objection, Your Honor." "Very well," Judge Kyle said. "Proceed with your examination, Mr. Mason." "Is the defendant related to you in any way, Mr. Shelby?" Mason asked. Shelby looked straight ahead, said, "Yes, sir. She's my daughter." There was a ripple of whispering in the audience in the back of the court. "Will you explain, please?" The defendant is the daughter of a woman who was my housekeeper, a woman I loved deeply. I was prevented from marrying her because of legal complications, and afterwards it was deemed better to continue our relationship as it was, with the understanding that Daphne would consider herself my niece. In order to protect her, I made a will. That will, of course, left everything to Daphne's mother. After Daphne's mother died, I intended to change the will to leave everything to Daphne, but it was one of those things I just never got around to doing until it was almost too late. You have made such a will now?" "Yes." "And it was made freely and of your own volition?" "Yes." "You were confined at the Goodwill Sanitarium?" "Yes, sir. Very much against my will." "What happened?" "Daphne rescued me." Daphne, by this time, was sobbing quietly into her handkerchief. Horace Shelby went on to tell his story, describing in detail his escape from the sanitarium, his tenancy at the Northern Lights Motel, the demands of Ralph Exeter, the manner in which he had drugged him, the stealing of his car. At length, Mason turned to the prosecution's table. "Do you wish to cross-examine?" Hamilton Berger said, "If the court please, we ask that the court give us until 2 o'clock this afternoon to plan our strategy." "Very well," Judge Kyle said. "The court will take a recess until 2 o'clock this afternoon." Horace Shelby turned to Daphne, embraced her. Paul Drake came over to Perry Mason. "Something funny, Perry," he said in a low voice. "What?" "This morning, after Lieutenant Tragg gave his testimony, Warden Finchley went down to the place where his car was parked. He got into the car, drove out to a vacant lot pretty well covered with weeds, took a wrench from his car, went into the vacant lot, and dropped the wrench." "Your man was shadowing him?" "Yes." "Did your man get the wrench?" "No, not yet. He didn't have an opportunity. He continued to shadow Warden Finchley, who drove back to the courthouse to attend the rest of the trial session." Mason walked over to Lieutenant Tragg. "You testified, rather glibly, that pipe was the same this morning." "Yes, you and I know it's the same pipe. I didn't sit up all night with it, but I can identify it." "You made a mistake. I took out the section of pipe, using a chamois skin to pad the jaws of the wrench, and substituted this one, which has purely synthetic tool marks in it, which were carefully put in there with a pipe wrench, where one of the ridges on the jaws had been purposely damaged." Tragg's face flushed. "You've destroyed evidence in a murder case." "Oh, no, I haven't. Here's the piece of pipe that I took out. I just took the precaution of keeping it in custody." Tragg's eyes showed his anger. "But," Mason went on, "the reason I did what I did was that I wanted whoever had actually loosened that gas pipe to feel that his wrench had left distinctive marks on the pipe. For your information, this morning Warden Finchley went to his car, drove out to a vacant lot, and tossed a wrench into the weeds, then returned to court. Now, if I call Warden Finchley as a witness and suddenly spring this on him, I can trap him into some damaging admissions. But that's going to make the homicide squad look rather inept. If, however, you go to work on him during the noon recess, don't let him know there's anything phony about the markings on that gas pipe. You just might have a confession by 2 o'clock this afternoon, and no one would ever need to know that there had ever been any substitution of the gas pipe. The police could have all the credit of solving the case." "Where's the vacant lot?" Tragg asked. Mason caught Paul Drake's eye, beckoned him over, said, "Paul, Get your man who is shadowing Borden Finchley and let him cooperate with Lieutenant Tragg." He then turned away, smiled at Daphne, and said, "See you after lunch." Daphne, her arms tight around Horace Shelby, looked up at him with tear-stained eyes. Mason moved over to Della Street. "This," he announced, "is one hell of a good time to make our exit." When the court reconvened at 2 o'clock, Hamilton Berger arose to address Judge Kyle. "If the court please," he said, "the state has a rather important announcement to make. Thanks to brilliant detective work on the part of the police, in particular the homicide squad, more particularly Lieutenant Arthur Tragg," Berger said, "the murder has been solved and the police have a written confession from Borden Finchley. I may state briefly that Finchley discovered Ralph Exeter unconscious under such circumstances that he felt he could disconnect the gas feed line, asphyxiate Exeter, and not only escape responsibility for the crime, but have the crime blamed upon Horace Shelby. In his somewhat warped mind, he felt that if Shelby were executed for the crime, he would be the sole heir. However, his primary purpose was to get rid of the pressure which Ralph Exeter was bringing to bear on him to pay a very substantial gambling debt, which had been incurred over a period of some months. I therefore wish to make public acknowledgment of thanks to Lieutenant Tragg, and the prosecution wishes to dismiss the case against the defendant Daphne Shelby." Judge Kyle, his eyes twinkling, looked at Perry Mason and said, "The case against the defendant is dismissed and she is released from custody forthwith. Court's adjourned." Lieutenant Tragg sidled over to Perry Mason. "You're pretty damn clever, Mason. You got away with it this time, but don't push your luck." Mason grinned at him and said, "I hate to be static, Lieutenant. I like to push my luck. Did Finchley tell you how he located Shelby?" "Las Vegas gamblers located him. They put the finger on him. It was agreed Exeter would make one big play for a cash settlement. Finchley wanted a cut. He went out to the motel, found Exeter drugged. He thought he could get Exeter off his neck. He got a wrench from the toolbox in his car, unscrewed the gas feed line, drove back and told his wife to cover for him on an alibi." Mason nodded. "That figures," he said. Tragg suddenly shot out his right hand, gripped Mason's hand, and shook hands cordially. "Thanks for the buggy ride," he said. A newspaper photographer exploded a flashbulb and caught the two men shaking hands. A reporter moved over and said to Mason, "What was that Tragg said to you?" Mason said, "The lieutenant was simply saying that if I had only put my cards on the table with him a little sooner, they would never have arrested Daphne Shelby." Tragg beamed at the lawyer. The newspaper reporter seemed puzzled. "Well, why didn't you?" he asked. Mason turned to where Horace Shelby was writing out a check. "And cheat myself out of a good fee?" he asked. The reporter laughed, and the photographer put in a new flashbulb to hurry over and get a picture of Mason accepting the check.